Close your eyes and let yourself drift back to a time when the galaxy teetered on the edge of war, when the bright halls of the Republic's Senate echoed with urgent debates, and when, in the distant ocean world of Kamino, something extraordinary was taking shape beneath storm-laden skies. In the year 22 BBY, as political tensions reached a breaking point across the galaxy, few could have imagined that the solution to the Republic's military crisis would emerge from the carefully controlled laboratories of a water world at the galaxy's edge. The Kaminoans, master genetic engineers whose tall, graceful forms moved through sterile white corridors with practiced precision, had been working for nearly a decade on what would become known as the Grand Army of the Republic. But within this vast military undertaking lay a smaller, more specialized project, one that would produce some of the most elite soldiers the galaxy had ever known. The clone Commandos were not an afterthought or a simple variation on the standard clone trooper template. From the very beginning, even before their genetic development began, they were envisioned as something apart, soldiers who could accomplish what regular formations could not, who could slip into impossible situations and emerge victorious through skill, teamwork, and an almost supernatural level of training. Where the Grand Army would rely on overwhelming numbers and coordinated assault, the Commandos would depend on precision, stealth, and the kind of small unit tactics that could turn the tide of entire campaigns. The story begins not with the Commandos themselves, but with their template, Jango Fett, the Mandalorian bounty hunter whose genetic code would become the foundation for millions of soldiers. Jango was no ordinary mercenary. He carried within his very DNA the warrior traditions of Mandalore, a culture that had produced some of the galaxy's most feared fighters for millennia. When the Kaminoans approached him to become the genetic template for their clone army, they weren't just acquiring the physical attributes of an exceptional soldier. They were capturing something far more valuable, the martial heritage of an entire civilization. But Jango Fett's contribution to the Commando program went beyond his genetic material. The Kaminoans, practical beings despite their ethereal appearance, understood that superior genetics meant nothing without superior training. They needed instructors who could push these enhanced clones beyond the limits of ordinary soldiers, who could instill in them not just fighting skills, but the warrior ethos that would keep them alive in the most dangerous missions the Republic could devise. This is where the true genesis of the Clone Commando program reveals its genius. Jango Fett didn't just donate his DNA and disappear into the galactic underworld with his payment. He took an active role in shaping the training protocols that would forge these special soldiers. And more importantly, he recruited a cadre of Mandalorian instructors to join him on Kamino. These weren't just any Mandalorians. They were carefully chosen veterans, each one a specialist in different aspects of warfare, each one committed to passing on the accumulated martial wisdom of their people. The difference between a regular clone trooper and a clone commando became apparent from the very moment of their creation. While standard clones were gestated in large batches, selected for duty based on their physical development, and trained in massive groups, the commandos were handpicked during their earliest growth stages. Kaminoan geneticists would carefully examine each developing clone, looking for subtle variations that indicated enhanced reflexes, superior spatial reasoning, or that indefinable quality they simply called command presence. Once selected, these future commandos were separated from their brothers and placed into a completely different developmental track. Where regular clones received standardized education downloads and followed predetermined training schedules, the commandos were exposed to individualized instruction from a moment they could comprehend it. Each squad of 4 was assigned to a specific Mandalorian instructor, creating a bond that would last throughout their training and beyond. The training facility on Kamino where the commandos were forged bore little resemblance to the vast halls where standard clone troopers learned to march in formation. Instead, it was a maze of specialized chambers designed to test every aspect of a soldier's capabilities. There were rooms where gravity could be adjusted to simulate combat in different planetary environments, chambers filled with obstacles that required not just physical prowess, but creative problem-solving, and holographic training centers that could recreate any battlefield scenario with perfect fidelity. But perhaps the most important aspect of Commando training wasn't technological at all. It was philosophical. The Mandalorian instructors didn't just teach these young clones how to fight. They taught them how to think like warriors. They learned that true strength came not from following orders blindly, but from understanding the mission so completely that they could adapt and improvise when the original plan fell apart. They were taught to see their squad mates not as fellow soldiers, but as brothers whose lives were as precious as their own. This brotherhood wasn't just a military expedient. It was a fundamental rewiring of how these clones understood themselves and their place in the universe. Regular clone troopers, for all their loyalty and courage, were designed to be interchangeable parts in a vast military machine. Commandos, by contrast, were trained to be irreplaceable specialists, each one unique, each one bringing something special to their squad that couldn't be replicated by anyone else. The physical training was legendary in its intensity. Where regular clones spent their days learning to coordinate in large formations, Commandos were pushed to excel as individuals while never losing sight of their team. They learned to move through any terrain, urban environments, dense forests, underground tunnels, zero-gravity installations, with equal facility. They mastered weapons ranging from precision sniper rifles to heavy demolitions. But more importantly, they learned to see every object in their environment as a potential tool or weapon. But the Mandalorian influence went deeper than combat techniques. These instructors brought with them a culture that prized individual achievement within the context of absolute loyalty to one's brothers. They taught the young Commandos to develop their own personalities, to find their own voices, even to choose their own names, something that was strictly forbidden among regular clone troopers. This wasn't seen as a breach of military discipline, but as a necessary step in creating soldiers who could think independently under pressure. The result was something unprecedented in military history. Soldiers who were genetically identical, but psychologically unique, who shared the same basic training, but had developed specialized skills that complemented their squad mates perfectly. A commando squad wasn't just 4 soldiers working together. It was a single organism with 4 minds, capable of communication so subtle and coordination so precise that they could accomplish missions that would require entire companies of regular troops. As their training progressed, these future commandos began to understand that they were being prepared for something extraordinary. Regular clone troopers trained for conventional warfare, holding lines, taking objectives, supporting larger military operations. Commandos trained for the impossible, infiltrating enemy strongholds, eliminating high-value targets, conducting rescue missions behind enemy lines, and surviving in hostile territory with no hope of reinforcement or extraction. The psychological conditioning was as important as the physical training. These clones had to be prepared to operate completely cut off from the normal support structures of military life. They couldn't rely on reinforcements arriving to save them if a mission went wrong. They couldn't expect resupply if they ran low on equipment. They had to be mentally prepared to make decisions that regular soldiers would never face, to complete missions that others would consider suicide assignments. Perhaps most importantly, they had to learn to trust each other completely. In a regular military unit, soldiers might work together for months or years before developing the kind of bond that commandos needed from day one. These squads were formed during training and stayed together throughout their service, creating a level of mutual understanding that bordered on telepathy. Each commando knew exactly how his brothers would react in any given situation, could predict their movements and decisions with uncanny accuracy. As the Clone Wars approached, the first generation of commandos neared the completion of their training. They had spent nearly a decade in development and preparation, far longer than any other military unit in history. But this investment of time and resources was about to pay dividends beyond anything the Republic could have imagined. The Commandos represented something entirely new in galactic warfare. Soldiers who combined the best aspects of special forces, intelligence operatives, and elite combat units. They were trained to gather information as skillfully as they fought, to blend into civilian populations when necessary, to survive for weeks or months in hostile territory while maintaining their combat effectiveness. They were, in every sense of the word, the perfect soldiers for a war that would be fought not just on battlefields, but in shadows behind enemy lines and in the spaces between conventional military doctrine. As their training reached its final stages, the Commandos were organized into squads with designations that would become legendary. Delta Squad, consisting of Boss, Fixer, Scorch, and Sev, would become perhaps the most famous, but they were just one of many such units. Omega Squad, led by Niner and including Darman, Phi, and Aten, would prove equally skilled in different ways. Foxtrot Group, under the command of Captain Gregor, would demonstrate the adaptability and resilience that made Commandos so valuable. Each squad developed its own identity, its own internal culture, while maintaining the core values and capabilities that defined all Commando units. Some squads specialized in demolitions and direct assault. Others focused on reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. Some became expert at working with local resistance movements. Others excelled at deep cover infiltration missions. But all of them shared the fundamental characteristics that made them Commandos: superior training, unshakable brotherhood, and the ability to accomplish the impossible. The equipment developed specifically for the Commandos reflected their unique role in the Republic's military strategy. Their armor, designated as Katarn class, was a masterpiece of military engineering that combined the protective capabilities of standard clone trooper armor with specialized systems designed for stealth and independent operation. The armor included advanced sensor packages, encrypted communication systems, and environmental seals that allowed Commandos to operate in any atmosphere or even the vacuum of space. But perhaps the most important feature of Commando armor was its modular design. Unlike the standardized equipment of regular clone troopers, Commando armor could be modified and customized for specific missions. Demolition specialists could add armor plating and specialized tool slots. Snipers could integrate advanced targeting systems and cloaking devices. Infiltration specialists could install silent movement systems and enhanced sensor baffles. The weapons issued to Commandos were similarly specialized. While regular clone troopers were equipped with standardized blaster rifles designed for volume of fire and ease of maintenance, Commandos received a variety of weapons designed for specific tactical situations. The DC-17M interchangeable weapon system became the standard Commando weapon, capable of being configured as an assault rifle, sniper weapon, or anti-armor device, depending on mission requirements. But weapons and armor were just tools. The real strength of the Commando program lay in the soldiers themselves. By the time the Clone Wars began, the Republic had approximately 100 Commando squads at its disposal, just 400 of the most elite soldiers ever created. Compared to the millions of regular clone troopers, they were a tiny force, but their impact would be felt far beyond their numbers. The Commandos were ready for war, but the war that was coming would test them in ways their training could never fully prepare them for. The neat, controlled environments of Kamino bore little resemblance to the chaos and uncertainty of actual combat. The carefully scripted training scenarios, no matter how challenging, couldn't replicate the emotional and psychological pressures of real missions, where failure meant not just personal death, but the potential collapse of entire military operations. And yet, as the first Commandos prepared to leave Kamino for active duty, their instructors had confidence that these soldiers would not just survive, but excel in whatever challenges awaited them. They had been forged in the crucible of the most demanding military training ever devised, shaped by a warrior culture that had endured for millennia, and bonded to their brothers in ways that transcended ordinary military loyalty. The galaxy was about to discover what 400 of the most elite soldiers in history could accomplish when the very survival of the Republic hung in the balance. The morning of the first Battle of Geonosis dawned with all the anticipation and dread that marks the beginning of a war that will reshape everything. In the command centers scattered across the massive Republic assault ships approaching the Red Desert world, clone commanders made final preparations for what many believed would be a quick rescue mission to save captured Jedi. Few realized they were about to witness the opening shots of a galactic conflict that would consume 3 years and countless lives. Among those preparing for battle were 5 Commando units, barely 3 months out of their final training phases on Kamino. These 20 elite soldiers represented the first operational deployment of the Commando program, a test under fire that would determine whether the Republic's investment in Special Forces training had been worthwhile. Standing in the cramped confines of their LAT/I gunships, checking equipment and reviewing mission parameters, these commandos carried with them not just their own hopes of success, but the reputation of every brother they had left behind on Kamino. Clone Commander Pons, himself a product of the accelerated officer training program that had produced the Republic's military leadership in record time, found himself in the unusual position of briefing soldiers who, in some ways, were more extensively trained than he was. The commandos had spent years preparing for combat. Pons and his fellow commanders had been rushed through officer training to meet the immediate needs of a republic suddenly forced into war. "I have 5 special commando units awaiting your orders, sir," Pons reported to Jedi Master Mace Windu as the Jedi General reviewed the holographic displays showing separatist positions across Geonosis. The formality of the moment masked the significance of what was happening. For the first time in galactic history, the Republic was deploying soldiers specifically designed for the kind of surgical strikes that could turn the tide of conventional battles. Windu, for his part, understood the value of what he was being offered. The Jedi had always operated as small, elite units capable of accomplishing missions that regular military forces could not. The Commandos represented a military extension of that philosophy. Soldiers who could match Jedi effectiveness in certain scenarios while bringing specialized combat skills that even Force users might lack. The missions assigned to the Commando units reflected both the urgency of the Geonosis situation and the high expectations placed on these new soldiers. While the main clone army would conduct frontal assaults on the primary separatist positions, the Commandos would be tasked with objectives that required stealth, precision, and the ability to operate independently behind enemy lines. Delta Squad, led by the clone who had chosen the name Boss, received perhaps the most critical assignment: the elimination of a high-value separatist target whose death could significantly disrupt enemy coordination. The target was Sun FAC, the Geonosian lieutenant who served as one of Count Dooku's key military advisors and whose intimate knowledge of Geonosis's underground tunnel systems made him invaluable to separatist defensive efforts. The mission briefing was necessarily brief, conducted in the final minutes before the LAT/I gunships launched toward the planet's surface. Boss gathered his squad, Fixer, Scorch, and Sev, around a portable holographic projector that displayed the terrain they would be operating in. The primary objective was clear: infiltrate the separatist stronghold, eliminate Sun FAC, and extract without alerting enemy forces to their presence. But even as Boss outlined the mission parameters, all 4 commandos understood that their assignment represented something far more significant than a single assassination. They were about to become the first clone commandos to enter combat, the first to test their training against real enemies, the first to discover whether the years of preparation on Kamino had truly prepared them for the reality of war. Fixer, whose rigid adherence to military protocol had earned him his nickname, reviewed the technical aspects of their insertion and extraction plans. Unlike regular clone troopers, who could rely on established communication networks and predetermined rally points, the commandos would be operating in complete isolation once they left their gunship. Their success would depend entirely on their ability to work together as a perfectly coordinated unit. Scorch, the squad's demolitions expert whose irreverent humor had made him both beloved and occasionally exasperating to his instructors, checked and rechecked his specialized equipment. The mission would likely require precise use of explosives, and Scorch knew that a single mistake could not only doom their mission, but alert every separatist force on the planet to their presence. Sev, the squad's designated marksman, whose dark sense of humor masked a fierce dedication to his brothers, made final adjustments to his sniper rifle. His role in the mission would be critical, providing overwatch and covering fire while Boss, Fixer, and Scorch moved in for the actual elimination. If things went wrong, Sev's ability to engage targets at long range might be the only thing standing between his squad and complete disaster. As their gunship broke through Geonosis's atmosphere and the red desert landscape spread out below them, the commandos of Delta Squad experienced something their training had never quite prepared them for: the psychological impact of entering their first real combat zone. The carefully controlled environments of Kamino, no matter how challenging, had always been fundamentally safe. Here, over Geonosis, death was a very real possibility. But rather than fear, what the commandos felt was a strange sense of completion. Everything they had trained for, every skill they had developed, every bond they had forged with their brothers, was about to be tested in the ultimate crucible. They were, in a very real sense, about to discover who they truly were. The insertion went according to plan initially. Delta Squad's LAT/I approached their target zone under cover of the main assault, using the chaos and confusion of the larger battle to mask their approach. The gunship's pilot, a clone trooper cross-trained for special operations support, brought them in low and fast, skimming the rocky outcroppings that characterized Geonosis's surface. The landing zone was a narrow canyon approximately 2 kilometers from Sun FAC's last known position, chosen for its isolation from major separatist patrol routes and its proximity to one of the tunnel entrances that honeycombed the planet's surface. As the gunship's engines wound down and the commandos disembarked, they found themselves in an alien landscape that bore no resemblance to anything they had trained in on Kamino. Geonosis was a world of harsh contrasts. Towering rock spires that seemed to claw at the sky, deep canyons carved by ancient geological processes, and an ever-present red dust that seemed to infiltrate everything despite their armor's environmental seals. The air itself carried the sound of distant battle, the thunder of heavy artillery, the whine of starfighter engines, and the occasional tremor that indicated massive explosions somewhere beyond the horizon. Boss quickly established their operational perimeter, using hand signals to position his squad for maximum security while they oriented themselves to their new environment. The commandos moved with a fluid precision that spoke to their years of training together, each one instinctively knowing where his brothers would be and what they would be doing at any given moment. Fixer immediately began establishing their communication protocols, setting up the specialized equipment that would allow them to maintain contact with each other while remaining undetectable to separatist monitoring systems. The technology was cutting-edge, developed specifically for commando operations, but it still required skilled operation to function effectively in combat conditions. Scorch conducted a preliminary reconnaissance of their immediate area, looking for potential threats, alternative routes, and locations where his demolition skills might prove useful. The canyon offered good concealment, but it also presented potential bottlenecks that could trap them if they were discovered by enemy forces. Sev found an elevated position that provided overwatch capabilities while remaining hidden from casual observation. From his vantage point, he could cover the most likely approaches to their position while maintaining visual contact with the tunnel entrance they would need to use to reach their target. The first hour of their mission proceeded exactly as their training had prepared them for. They moved through the Geonosian underground with careful precision, using the maps provided by Republic intelligence to navigate the maze of tunnels that connected various parts of the planet's surface. The tunnels themselves were marvels of Geonosian engineering, carved with the geometric precision that characterized the insectoid species architecture. But it was in these tunnels that Delta Squad encountered their first real surprise: the presence of other commando units, also making their way toward high-value targets scattered across the underground complex. The chance meeting in a main tunnel junction provided the first indication that the commando deployment on Geonosis was more extensive than any single squad had been told. The meeting was brief. Operational security demanded that each unit continue with its assigned mission, but it provided Delta Squad with valuable intelligence about separatist defensive measures they hadn't been briefed on. The other squads had encountered automated defense systems, droid patrols, and security measures that suggested the Separatists had anticipated the possibility of Republic Special Forces operations. This intelligence forced Boss to make the first significant tactical adjustment of the mission. The original plan had called for a direct approach to Sun FAC's position, but the presence of enhanced security measures suggested that such an approach would likely result in early detection and mission failure. Instead, Boss made the decision to take a longer, more circuitous route that would add hours to their timeline, but significantly reduce their chances of premature discovery. The decision represented exactly the kind of independent thinking that Commando training was designed to foster. Rather than rigidly following predetermined plans, Boss was adapting to changing circumstances while keeping the mission objective clearly in mind. It was a textbook example of the tactical flexibility that made Commandos so valuable, but it was also the first real test of their ability to function as an autonomous unit under combat stress. The longer route took them deeper into the Geonosian underground, through sections of the tunnel system that appeared on no Republic intelligence maps. Here, they encountered the first real evidence of the planet's true nature: vast underground chambers filled with the machinery of war production, automated factories churning out battle droids by the thousands, and the ever-present sound of Geonosian workers carrying out the business of supporting the Separatist war effort. It was Scorch who first suggested that their mission parameters might need to expand beyond simple assassination. The manufacturing capabilities they were observing represented a strategic threat to the Republic that went far beyond any single individual, no matter how important. The destruction of these facilities could potentially eliminate Geonosis as a major source of Separatist military hardware. But Boss, demonstrating the command judgment that had earned him his leadership position, made the decision to stick with their original assignment. The temptation to expand their mission was understandable, but Commando doctrine emphasized the importance of completing assigned objectives rather than getting distracted by targets of opportunity. Other Republic forces would deal with the manufacturing facilities. Delta Squad's job was to eliminate Sun FAC. As they approached their target's location, the Commandos encountered their first serious resistance. A Geonosian patrol, investigating what might have been routine security concerns, discovered evidence of their passage through the tunnels. The discovery triggered the first combat engagement of Delta Squad's career, a brief but intense firefight in the confined space of a tunnel junction. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes, but it demonstrated both the effectiveness of Commando training and the reality of combat in ways that no simulation ever could. The Geonosians, fighting on their home ground with intimate knowledge of the terrain, proved to be formidable opponents despite their apparent technological disadvantages. Sev's marksmanship proved decisive in the engagement. His ability to place precise shots in the difficult lighting conditions of the underground complex, eliminating 3 Geonosian warriors before they could effectively coordinate their defense. Fixer's technical skills proved equally valuable, as he was able to disable the patrol's communication equipment before they could alert other Separatist forces to the Republic infiltration. Scorch's demolitions expertise, while not needed for the engagement itself, proved crucial in its aftermath. He was able to use carefully placed charges to collapse sections of tunnel behind them, creating obstacles that would delay any pursuit while avoiding the kind of massive explosions that might alert distant enemy forces to their presence. Boss coordinated the entire engagement with the kind of tactical awareness that justified his position as squad leader. He was able to direct his brother's efforts while maintaining situational awareness of the larger tactical picture, ensuring that their immediate success didn't compromise their ultimate mission. The engagement's aftermath provided the Commandos with their first real lesson in the psychological realities of combat. The Geonosians they had killed were the first sentient beings any of them had ever taken the life of, and the experience carried emotional weight that their training had acknowledged but never fully prepared them for. But there was no time for extended reflection. The engagement had inevitably created evidence of their presence that would eventually be discovered, which meant their window for completing the mission successfully was now significantly shortened. They had to reach Sun FAC quickly, eliminate him, and extract before separatist forces could organize an effective search. The final approach to Sun FAC's position required all of the stealth and infiltration skills the Commandos had developed during their training. The Geonosian lieutenant was located in a heavily defended command center, surrounded by both automated defenses and living guards. The facility represented exactly the kind of target their training had prepared them for: heavily defended, requiring precision rather than brute force, and offering no possibility of success through conventional military approaches. Boss divided his squad for the final phase of the mission. Sev took up an overwatch position that provided cover for the facility's main approaches while giving him clear fields of fire if things went wrong. Fixer worked to penetrate the facility's electronic security systems, using his slicing skills to create openings in their defenses while avoiding triggering alarms. Scorch prepared the charges that would be used both to create their entry point and to destroy key systems within the facility after Sun FAC's elimination. The explosive devices had to be precisely calibrated, powerful enough to accomplish their intended purposes, but not so powerful as to bring down sections of the underground complex that might trap the squad during their extraction. Boss himself took responsibility for the actual assassination, a task that required not just combat skills, but the psychological preparation to kill a specific individual in what amounted to cold blood. The mission parameters were clear, but the emotional reality of executing a targeted killing was something that individual commandos had to come to terms with on their own. The penetration of Sun FAC's command center went smoothly initially. Fixer's electronic infiltration opened doors and disabled security sensors with minimal difficulty, while Scorch's precisely placed charges created their entry point without triggering massive alarms. Sev's overwatch position allowed him to eliminate 2 sentries who might have otherwise detected the squad's approach. But it was when Boss actually encountered Sun FAC that the mission took an unexpected turn. The Geonosian lieutenant, rather than being the isolated target their intelligence had suggested, was in the middle of a crucial planning session with several other high-ranking separatist officers. The elimination of all these individuals would represent a significant intelligence coup, but it would also require a much more complex operation than originally planned. Boss made the decision to proceed with the expanded mission, recognizing that the opportunity to eliminate multiple high-value targets might not come again. The decision required split-second tactical judgment of exactly the kind that commando training was designed to develop, but it also carried significantly higher risks of discovery and mission failure. The elimination itself was accomplished with the clinical precision that characterized commando operations. Boss moved through the command center with deadly efficiency, his training and equipment allowing him to eliminate all the targets before any of them could raise an alarm or call for assistance. But the expanded scope of the operation meant that their extraction window was now even more compressed. The destruction of the command center was left to Scorch, whose charges not only eliminated the facility's operational capabilities, but also created enough confusion and debris to mask the squad's escape route. The explosions were carefully timed to allow the commandos to reach safety while creating maximum disruption to separatist operations in the immediate area. The extraction from Geonosis proved to be the most challenging part of the entire mission. The destruction of Sun FAC's command center had inevitably alerted separatist forces to the presence of Republic Special Operations units, triggering a planet-wide search that threatened to trap Delta Squad behind enemy lines. But it was during the extraction that the Commandos demonstrated one of their most valuable capabilities: the ability to adapt and survive in hostile territory without external support. Using the skills they had developed during training, they were able to evade separatist search teams while making their way back to friendly lines. The journey back to the Republic forces took nearly 18 hours, during which time Delta Squad had to navigate not just hostile terrain, but active combat zones where the main battle for Geonosis continued to rage. They witnessed firsthand the massive scale of the conflict they were contributing to, seeing clone troopers and battle droids locked in combat across the planet's surface. When they finally reached friendly lines, Delta Squad had completed not just their first mission, but the first successful clone commando operation in Republic military history. The elimination of Sun FAC and his staff had contributed to the disruption of separatist coordination that helped ensure Republic victory in the overall battle. But perhaps more importantly, they had demonstrated that the commando program worked exactly as intended. For soldiers operating independently behind enemy lines, had accomplished a mission that would have required hundreds of regular troops and might not have been possible at all using conventional military approaches. The success of Delta Squad and the other commando units deployed on Geonosis validated the Republic's investment in special forces and established the template for how these elite soldiers would be used throughout the Clone Wars. But it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in the story of the Clone Army, one in which a small number of extraordinary soldiers would consistently punch far above their weight in determining the outcome of galactic conflicts. As the dust settled on Geonosis and the Republic began to comprehend the scope of the war they had just entered, the clone commandos prepared for their next assignments. They had proven themselves in battle, but they had also learned that their training, however extensive, could never fully prepare them for the reality of war. The galaxy had changed forever with the first shots fired on Geonosis, and the clone commandos would play a crucial role in shaping how that change would unfold in the years to come. In the immediate aftermath of the Geonosis victory, the Republic found itself in possession of something it had never had before: detailed intelligence about separatist military capabilities, industrial infrastructure, and strategic planning. Much of this intelligence came from the successful commando operations during the battle, and it painted a picture of a conflict that would be far more extensive and challenging than anyone had initially anticipated. The separatist movement wasn't just a political rebellion supported by a handful of disgruntled systems. It was a massive military-industrial complex capable of producing war materials on a scale that matched or exceeded the Republic's own capabilities. The droid factories observed by commando units during their infiltration missions represented just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the Confederacy's ability to wage sustained warfare. For the clone commandos, this intelligence bonanza meant that their specialized skills would be in high demand as the Republic sought to understand and counter the separatist threat. The success of the Geonosis operations had demonstrated that small, elite units could gather information and accomplish objectives that would be impossible for conventional forces, making the commandos an invaluable resource in the intelligence war that would run parallel to the broader military conflict. Delta Squad, still basking in the success of their first mission, received their next assignment while still on Geonosis. Republic intelligence had identified a separatist communications facility on a nearby asteroid that was believed to be coordinating Confederate forces across the entire sector. The destruction of this facility would significantly disrupt enemy operations while providing valuable intelligence about separatist command and control procedures. The mission represented a significant escalation in both complexity and importance from their Geonosis assignment, where the elimination of Sun FAC had been essentially a targeted assassination with limited strategic implications. The destruction of the communications facility would have sector-wide ramifications and would likely trigger significant separatist countermeasures. Boss gathered his squad for the mission briefing in the cramped confines of a Republic cruiser's briefing room, the first time they had conducted formal mission planning outside the familiar environment of their training facilities. The holographic display showed the target asteroid, a barren rock in an otherwise empty system that had been chosen by the Separatists precisely because of its isolation and defensibility. The facility itself was a masterpiece of military engineering, built into the asteroid's core and protected by both natural rock formations and extensive artificial defenses. Intelligence estimates suggested that the facility was defended by approximately 200 battle droids, multiple automated weapon systems, and a command staff of organic separatist officers whose capture would provide significant intelligence value. But what made the mission particularly challenging was its location. The asteroid was situated in a system with no nearby Republic forces, meaning that Delta Squad would be operating completely without support or possibility of reinforcement. If something went wrong, they would be entirely on their own until they could complete their mission and return to friendly territory. Fixer immediately began analyzing the technical challenges the mission would present. The facility's location within the asteroid meant that conventional assault techniques would be impossible. There was simply no way for Republic forces to conduct a direct attack on a target buried under kilometers of solid rock. The only way to reach the facility would be through stealth infiltration using the asteroid's own access tunnels. Scorch studied the facility's internal layout, identifying critical systems whose destruction would not only eliminate the communications capability, but might also create enough chaos to mask their extraction. The asteroid facility represented a perfect target for his demolitions expertise, but it also presented unique challenges in terms of calculating explosive effects in the low-gravity, artificial atmosphere environment. Sev examined the external approaches to the asteroid, looking for positions where his sniper skills might prove useful, while also analyzing potential escape routes if their cover was blown. The asteroid's irregular surface and low gravity would create unique ballistic challenges that would test his marksmanship skills in ways his training had never explored. Boss coordinated the overall planning while considering the broader strategic implications of their mission. The intelligence gathered from this operation would likely influence Republic military strategy across multiple sectors, meaning that mission success would have ramifications far beyond their immediate tactical objectives. The approach to the target asteroid required a level of stealth that tested both their equipment and their training. Rather than using a standard Republic military vessel that would be immediately identified by Separatist sensors, Delta Squad traveled to the target system aboard a civilian freighter that had been modified for intelligence operations. The freighter, operated by Republic intelligence personnel, had been carefully prepared to appear as a legitimate commercial vessel conducting routine cargo operations in the neutral systems that bordered Separatist space. But hidden within its cargo holds were the specialized equipment and supplies the Commandos would need for their mission. The final approach to the asteroid required the Commandos to conduct what amounted to a covert spacewalk, using their armor's integrated propulsion systems to travel from the freighter to the asteroid surface without being detected by the facility's sensors. It was a technique they had practiced extensively during training, but doing it in an operational environment with the possibility of immediate discovery added psychological pressure that no simulation could replicate. The insertion went smoothly, with all 4 commandos reaching the asteroid surface and locating the access tunnel they would use to penetrate the facility. But it was once they entered the tunnel system that they encountered their first significant surprise: the presence of additional security measures that hadn't appeared in their intelligence briefings. The Separatists had apparently learned from the Republic's success on Geonosis and had upgraded their security procedures accordingly. The tunnel system was patrolled by teams of BX-series droid commandos, sophisticated battle droids specifically designed to counter special forces operations like the one Delta Squad was conducting. The BX commandos represented a new kind of threat that the Republic's intelligence services were still learning to assess. Unlike standard battle droids, which were designed for conventional combat in large formations, the BX units were programmed for small unit tactics, stealth operations, and the kind of independent thinking that had previously been the exclusive domain of organic special forces. Boss made the tactical decision to avoid contact with the BX patrols if possible, recognizing that engagement with these sophisticated droids would likely alert the entire facility to their presence. Instead, Delta Squad employed the advanced stealth techniques they had learned during training, using their armor's sensor-baffling systems and their own movement skills to remain undetected. The infiltration of the facility's core sections required Fixer to demonstrate electronic warfare skills that went beyond anything he had encountered during training. The Separatist computer systems were protected by multiple layers of security, including adaptive countermeasures that actively sought to identify and neutralize intrusion attempts. But Fixer's training had prepared him for exactly this kind of challenge. Rather than attempting to overwhelm the facility's security systems, he used subtle techniques to gradually gain access to critical systems while leaving minimal traces of his presence. It was electronic warfare as art form, requiring not just technical skill, but an intuitive understanding of how computer systems could be manipulated. While Fixer worked to penetrate the facility's electronic defenses, Scorch prepared the charges that would be used to destroy the communications equipment and create confusion during their extraction. But the asteroid environment presented unique challenges that required him to completely recalculate his demolitions techniques. In a low-gravity environment, conventional explosive effects would behave differently than on a planetary surface. The lack of substantial atmosphere meant that pressure waves wouldn't propagate the way they would in normal conditions. And the artificial life support systems meant that the wrong kind of explosive could potentially asphyxiate everyone in the facility, including the commandos themselves. Scorch's solution was to use a combination of shaped charges designed to direct their effects precisely where they would do the most damage to critical systems while avoiding the kind of massive structural damage that might trap them underground. It required calculations that pushed his technical training to its limits, but it also demonstrated the kind of creative problem-solving that made Commandos so effective. Sev, meanwhile, had taken up an overwatch position that allowed him to monitor the facility's main corridors while providing covering fire if their infiltration was discovered. But his position also gave him a unique perspective on the facility's operations, allowing him to observe Separatist personnel and procedures that provided valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities. What Sev observed was both encouraging and troubling. The Separatist personnel appeared to be well-trained and disciplined, suggesting that the Confederacy was taking the war seriously and investing in quality personnel rather than relying entirely on droid forces. But their security procedures also showed signs of the kind of complacency that could be exploited by skilled infiltrators. The actual destruction of the communications facility proceeded according to plan, with Scorch's carefully placed charges eliminating the key systems while creating enough chaos to mask the Commando's extraction. But it was during the extraction that Delta Squad encountered their most serious challenge yet, pursuit by BX droid commandos who had been alerted to their presence. The chase through the asteroid's tunnel system became a running battle that tested every aspect of their training. The BX commandos, while sophisticated, lacked the creative thinking and adaptability that made organic special forces so effective. But they made up for these limitations with superior numbers, perfect coordination, and the kind of relentless pursuit that only machines could maintain. Boss led his squad through a series of tactical maneuvers designed to use the asteroid's irregular gravity and confined spaces to their advantage. Rather than engaging in direct combat with their pursuers, they used the environment itself as a weapon, creating obstacles and hazards that the more rigid programming of the BX commandos couldn't easily adapt to. Fixer's technical skills proved crucial during the extraction, as he was able to manipulate the facility's automated systems to create additional obstacles for their pursuers. By overriding safety protocols and redirecting power flows, he created a series of equipment failures that forced the BX commandos to take longer routes while providing Delta Squad with opportunities to break contact. Scorch used his remaining demolitions to create choke points and obstacles that channeled their pursuers into predetermined killing zones, where Sev's marksmanship could be most effective. The combination of environmental manipulation and precision shooting allowed them to eliminate several BX commandos without getting drawn into the kind of sustained firefight that would favor their numerically superior opponents. The final extraction from the asteroid required the commandos to once again conduct a covert spacewalk, this time while being actively pursued by enemy forces. They were forced to abandon their original extraction point and use an alternative route that added significant time and complexity to their escape. But it was during this final phase of the mission that Delta Squad demonstrated one of the most important characteristics that separated commandos from regular soldiers: the ability to improvise and adapt when original plans fell apart. Rather than panicking or attempting to force their way through prepared defenses, they used their training and mutual trust to develop new approaches on the fly. The successful completion of their second major mission established Delta Squad as one of the Republic's premier special operations units. But it also highlighted the challenges that would face all Commando units as the war progressed. The Separatists were learning from their defeats and adapting their procedures accordingly, which meant that Commando operations would become increasingly difficult and dangerous. But perhaps more importantly, the mission demonstrated that the Commandos were capable of growth and development beyond their original training. Each engagement taught them new skills and techniques that they could apply to future missions, making them more effective with each operation they completed. As Delta Squad returned to Republic space, they brought with them not just the satisfaction of another successful mission, but also intelligence that would prove crucial to the broader war effort. The communications equipment they had destroyed contained information about Separatist force dispositions and strategic planning that gave Republic military leaders crucial insights into enemy capabilities and intentions. The success of these early Commando operations established a pattern that would continue throughout the Clone Wars. Small units of elite soldiers accomplishing objectives that would be impossible for conventional forces while gathering intelligence that shaped the broader strategic picture. But it also highlighted the unique pressures and challenges that these soldiers would face as the war intensified. For the clone Commandos, the early missions were just the beginning of a war that would test their skills, their brotherhood, and their fundamental understanding of what it meant to be soldiers in a galaxy torn apart by conflict. They had proven that their training worked, but they were about to discover that training was just the foundation for the real education they would receive in the crucible of ongoing warfare. As the Clone Wars entered its third month, the Clone Commandos had established themselves as an indispensable part of the Republic's military strategy. Their success rate on special operations missions was approaching 100%, a statistic that amazed even their most optimistic supporters and created demand for their services that far exceeded their limited numbers. But success in military operations, while important, represented only part of what made the Commandos unique within the Grand Army of the Republic. What truly set them apart was something that couldn't be measured in mission completion rates or enemy casualties. The extraordinary bond that existed between members of each squad, a brotherhood that transcended ordinary military camaraderie and approached something almost mystical in its intensity. This brotherhood hadn't emerged accidentally or as a simple byproduct of their shared training. It was the deliberate result of the psychological conditioning and cultural programming that their Mandalorian instructors had built into every aspect of their development. From their earliest conscious moments, the Commandos had been taught that their squad mates weren't just fellow soldiers, but literal brothers whose lives were as precious as their own. The concept of brotherhood among soldiers was nothing new, of course. Military units throughout galactic history had developed strong bonds forged by shared danger and mutual dependence. But the Commando Brotherhood went far beyond anything that had existed before, creating a level of mutual understanding and coordination that allowed for individuals to function as a single organism in combat. Delta Squad provided perhaps the clearest example of how this brotherhood manifested in operational effectiveness. Boss, Fixer, Scorch, and Sev had developed a level of nonverbal communication that allowed them to coordinate complex tactical maneuvers without spoken orders or even hand signals. Each member of the squad could predict his brother's actions with uncanny accuracy, creating tactical opportunities that would be impossible for less closely bonded units. But this coordination wasn't just a matter of tactical convenience. It reflected a profound psychological integration that affected every aspect of their lives. The Commandos didn't just work together. They thought together, felt together, and shared a collective identity that was stronger than any individual personality. Boss, as the squad's leader, bore the psychological burden of command in ways that regular clone commanders never experienced. His responsibility wasn't just to ensure mission success, but to protect the lives of soldiers who were genuinely irreplaceable. The loss of any member of his squad wouldn't just reduce their operational effectiveness. It would be a personal tragedy that would affect the surviving members for the rest of their lives. This responsibility had shaped Boss's development into a leader who combined tactical brilliance with genuine emotional intelligence. He understood that his authority derived not from rank or regulation, but from his brother's trust, and he exercised that authority with the kind of careful consideration that regular military doctrine rarely demanded. Fixer's role within the squad hierarchy reflected his personality traits, but also demonstrated how individual characteristics could be integrated into a collective identity. His rigid adherence to military protocol and technical precision provided the squad with a stabilizing influence during chaotic situations, but it also served a deeper psychological function by providing his brothers with a sense of continuity and reliability. But Fixer's apparent inflexibility masked a deep emotional commitment to his brothers that showed itself in subtle ways. He might insist on using operating numbers rather than chosen names during missions, but he also maintained detailed personal files on each squad member that tracked everything from equipment preferences to favorite recreational activities. His way of showing affection was through meticulous attention to the details that kept his brothers safe and effective. Scorch represented the squad's emotional outlet, the one member who was permitted and even encouraged to express the kind of irreverent humor that might be seen as insubordination in regular military units. But his role as the squad's comedian served important psychological functions beyond simply maintaining morale. Scorch's humor provided a release valve for the stress and tension that inevitably built up during dangerous operations. His ability to find something amusing even in the most dire circumstances helped his brothers maintain their psychological balance when facing situations that might otherwise overwhelm them. But his humor was never random or purposeless. It was carefully calibrated to provide exactly the kind of emotional support his brothers needed at any given moment. Sev presented perhaps the most complex personality within Delta Squad, a contradiction of dark humor and fierce loyalty that reflected the psychological challenges of their unique position within the Republic military. His sardonic worldview and apparently morbid sense of humor masked a level of emotional investment in his brothers that was deeper than anything the other squad members displayed openly. Sev's role as the squad's designated marksman required him to maintain psychological distance from the immediate tactical situation, observing and analyzing while his brothers engaged directly with threats. This perspective gave him unique insights into the dangers they faced while also creating a sense of isolation that he channeled into his distinctive personality. But beneath Sev's dark exterior lay a fierce protectiveness toward his brothers that manifested in his relentless pursuit of marksmanship perfection. Every shot he fired, every target he eliminated, was motivated not by abstract tactical considerations, but by his determination to keep his brothers alive. His apparent callousness toward enemy casualties reflected not a lack of empathy, but a total focus on the only lives that truly mattered to him. The brotherhood bonds that defined Delta Squad were replicated throughout the Commando program, but each squad developed its own unique characteristics and internal dynamics. Omega Squad, led by Sergeant Niner, demonstrated many of the same characteristics, but with important variations that reflected their different personalities and experiences. Niner himself represented a different leadership style than Boss, one that emphasized collective decision-making and shared responsibility rather than clear hierarchical authority. Where Boss commanded through a combination of tactical brilliance and personal charisma, Niner led through consultation and consensus building that drew on the individual strengths of all his brothers. Darman, Omega Squad's demolitions expert, shared many characteristics with Scorch, but expressed them in different ways. Where Scorch used humor to maintain squad morale, Darman channeled his energy into perfectionist attention to the technical aspects of their missions. His approach to explosives wasn't just about destroying targets. It was about creating exactly the right effects to support his brother's tactical needs. Phi, serving as Omega Squad's sniper and medic, combined Sev's marksmanship skills with a more openly emotional personality that served as the squad's primary source of interpersonal connection. Phi was the one who remembered birthdays, who checked on his brother's emotional well-being, who maintained the personal relationships that kept the squad functioning as a family rather than just a military unit. Otten, the squad's technical specialist, brought a quiet intensity to his work that reflected his personal history and the unique challenges he had faced during training. Unlike the other members of Omega Squad, Otten had been trained by Wallen Vav rather than Cal Scrata, creating subtle differences in his approach to problem-solving and brotherhood that enriched the squad's collective capabilities. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Commando Brotherhood was how it extended beyond individual squads to encompass the entire program. Despite their training in separate units under different instructors, all commandos shared a common identity that created bonds of mutual respect and support that transcended normal military relationships. This broader brotherhood manifested in practical ways during operations where multiple commando squads worked together. Units that had never operated together before could coordinate complex missions with minimal preparation because they shared common training, common values, and a common understanding of how elite soldiers should conduct themselves. The psychological foundation of this broader brotherhood lay in the shared experiences that all commandos had undergone during their development. They had all faced the same challenges, endured the same training, and been shaped by the same Mandalorian cultural influences. This created a level of mutual understanding that allowed commandos from different squads to work together as if they had trained together for years. But the Brotherhood also created unique vulnerabilities that affected commando operations in ways that Republic military leadership was still learning to understand. The intense bonds between squad members meant that the loss of even one commando could have devastating psychological effects on the survivors, potentially compromising their effectiveness for extended periods. The first major test of this vulnerability came during a mission on the planet Deveran, where Delta Squad was tasked with investigating reports of a massacre at a Republic outpost. The mission itself was routine by commando standards. Infiltrate the area, gather intelligence about what had happened, and report back to Republic Command with their findings. But what they discovered on Deveran challenged their understanding of the war they were fighting and their place within it. The outpost had been completely destroyed, with no survivors among either the Republic personnel or the local civilian population. The level of destruction suggested not just military defeat, but systematic extermination that went far beyond normal combat objectives. More disturbing still was the evidence that suggested the massacre had been conducted not by battle droids, but by organic separatist forces whose actions reflected a level of brutality that shocked even hardened soldiers. The commandos were accustomed to clean, tactical operations where objectives were accomplished with minimal collateral damage. The Deveran massacre represented something entirely different. Warfare as an instrument of terror and genocide. The psychological impact of the Deveran discovery affected all members of Delta Squad, but it hit Sev particularly hard. His dark sense of humor had always served as a defense mechanism against the emotional challenges of their work, but the evidence of systematic atrocities challenged his ability to maintain psychological distance from the broader implications of the war. Boss recognized the danger that Deveran represented to his squad's psychological cohesion and made the decision to request immediate reassignment to operational duties rather than the extended investigation that Republic intelligence wanted them to conduct. He understood that his brothers needed to return to the kind of clean, tactical operations where their skills could make a clear difference rather than dwelling on atrocities they couldn't prevent or undo. The decision demonstrated one of the most important aspects of commando leadership, the recognition that these soldiers' psychological well-being was as important as their tactical effectiveness. Boss's willingness to prioritize his brother's mental health over abstract intelligence requirements reflected the kind of human-centered leadership that made the Commando program unique within the Republic military. But the Deveran incident also highlighted one of the fundamental challenges that the Commandos would face throughout the war, reconciling their elite status and tactical effectiveness with the broader moral complexities of a galactic conflict that involved countless atrocities they couldn't prevent. The brotherhood that defined the Commando program provided them with the psychological resources to endure these challenges, but it also created expectations and responsibilities that went far beyond normal military duty. Each commando wasn't just responsible for completing missions. He was responsible for maintaining the emotional and psychological well-being of his brothers. This responsibility created a level of mutual dependence that was both a source of strength and a potential vulnerability. The bonds between squad members gave them extraordinary motivation and resilience, but they also meant that any threat to the brotherhood could have consequences that extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations. As the Clone Wars intensified and the Commandos faced increasingly dangerous missions, this brotherhood would be tested in ways that no training could fully prepare them for. They would face situations where the survival of the squad would conflict with mission objectives, where the bonds between brothers would be challenged by the harsh realities of warfare, and where their elite status would carry responsibilities they had never anticipated. But the foundation had been laid during these early months of the war, forged in the crucible of combat and strengthened by shared victory and sacrifice. The brotherhood that defined the clone commandos had proven itself in battle and would continue to evolve as the war demanded new kinds of courage and new forms of loyalty. The galaxy was about to discover just how far these soldiers would go to protect not just the republic they served, but the brothers who shared their extraordinary bond. Let your breathing slow as you contemplate these bonds forged in the fires of war, these connections deeper than blood, stronger than duty. Feel yourself drifting alongside these warriors as they discover what it truly means to fight not just for a cause, but for each other. As the first year of the Clone Wars draws to a close, let your mind wander to the quiet moments between battles, when these elite soldiers discover that their greatest challenges aren't always the missions they're assigned, but the growing weight of what they represent in a galaxy spinning toward darkness. By the beginning of 21 BBY, the Clone Wars had transformed from what many had hoped would be a brief police action into something far more ominous. A galaxy-spanning conflict that showed no signs of resolution. The initial optimism that had characterized the Republic's early victories had given way to a more sobering understanding of what they faced. The separatist movement wasn't a rebellion that could be crushed through a few decisive battles. It was a determined adversary with industrial capabilities that matched the Republic's own and a willingness to wage war on a scale that few had anticipated. For the clone commandos, this transformation in the war's character meant both opportunity and burden. Their early successes had established them as an invaluable asset in the Republic's military arsenal, leading to an exponential increase in the complexity and importance of the missions they were assigned. Where their first operations had been relatively straightforward tactical objectives, they now found themselves at the center of strategic operations that could influence the outcome of entire campaigns. But success brought its own challenges. The Commando program had been designed to produce approximately 100 squads, 400 of the most elite soldiers the galaxy had ever known. This number had seemed adequate during the planning stages, when the Clone Wars were envisioned as a limited conflict that could be resolved through conventional military means. As the war expanded beyond anyone's initial projections, the demand for commando services far exceeded the available supply. Republic military planners found themselves in the position of having to carefully ration the use of their most effective special operations assets. Every commando mission had to be weighed not just against its potential benefits, but against the opportunity cost of not using those same soldiers for other equally critical operations. It was a problem that no military organization in galactic history had faced. Having soldiers who were so effective that their scarcity became a strategic liability. This scarcity had profound effects on how the commandos themselves understood their role in the war. They were no longer just elite soldiers conducting specialized missions. They were irreplaceable strategic assets whose loss would have implications far beyond their individual squads. The psychological pressure of knowing that their survival was crucial to the Republic's war effort added a new dimension to the stress they faced in combat. Delta Squad, now veterans of multiple successful operations, found themselves assigned to missions that pushed the boundaries of what special operations forces were traditionally expected to accomplish. Their next major assignment took them to the outer rim world of Ord Mantell, where separatist forces had established a major logistics hub that was supplying Confederate operations across 3 sectors. The mission parameters were unlike anything they had previously encountered. Rather than a single, clearly defined objective, they were tasked with conducting a comprehensive intelligence-gathering operation that would map the entire separatist supply network, while simultaneously conducting sabotage operations designed to disrupt enemy logistics without revealing the extent of Republic knowledge about the system. Boss reviewed the mission briefing with a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with the tactical challenges they would face. The operation required them to spend an extended period operating behind enemy lines, potentially weeks or even months, while maintaining their cover and conducting multiple phases of intelligence gathering and sabotage. It was the kind of deep cover operation that intelligence services conducted, not the surgical strikes that commandos were designed for. But the mission also represented an opportunity to demonstrate the full range of capabilities that their training had prepared them for. Commandos have been educated not just as elite soldiers, but as intelligence operatives, saboteurs, and survival specialists. The Ord Mantell operation would test all of these capabilities in an integrated campaign that would showcase what made them truly unique within the Republic military. Fixer approached the technical challenges of the mission with his characteristic methodical precision, but even he was daunted by the scope of what they were being asked to accomplish. The separatist logistics network on Ord Mantell was a complex system involving multiple facilities, transportation nodes, and communication networks. Mapping this system completely would require infiltrating dozens of locations while avoiding detection by security measures that were specifically designed to counter Republic intelligence operations. The solution Fixer developed reflected both his technical expertise and his growing understanding of how to adapt commando capabilities to complex strategic objectives. Rather than attempting to physically infiltrate every facility, he designed a comprehensive electronic surveillance network that would allow them to monitor separatist communications and data flows while conducting targeted physical infiltrations of only the most critical locations. Scorch's role in the operation pushed his demolitions expertise in entirely new directions. Rather than the spectacular explosions that had characterized his previous missions, the Ord Mantell operation required subtle sabotage that would appear to be equipment failures or accidents. The goal wasn't to destroy the separatist logistics network, but to degrade its efficiency in ways that wouldn't be immediately apparent to enemy investigators. This required Scorch to develop entirely new techniques for creating delayed action devices that could cause failures weeks or months after their installation. He had to learn to think like an industrial saboteur rather than a combat engineer, focusing on subtle mechanical failures that would cascade into larger system breakdowns over time. Sev's contribution to the mission planning reflected his evolution from a simple marksman into a comprehensive reconnaissance specialist. His responsibility wasn't just to provide covering fire for his brothers, but to conduct detailed surveillance of enemy personnel, tracking their movements and identifying patterns that could be exploited for intelligence gathering or tactical advantage. The skills Sev was developing went far beyond traditional sniper training. He was learning to read human behavior, to identify relationships and hierarchies within enemy organizations, and to predict individual actions based on psychological profiling. It was work that required patience and analytical thinking that complemented his natural marksmanship abilities. The infiltration of Ord Mantell required the commandos to adopt covers as civilian contractors working for a supposedly neutral corporation that provided services to both Republic and Separatist clients. It was their first experience with deep cover operations, and it challenged their training in ways that combat missions never had. Maintaining civilian covers required them to suppress the military bearing that had become second nature during their years of training. They had to learn to move differently, speak differently, and interact with others in ways that wouldn't reveal their true nature. For soldiers whose entire identity had been built around their military excellence, pretending to be ordinary civilians was perhaps more challenging than any combat situation they had faced. Boss found himself assuming the role of a logistics coordinator, a position that required him to interact daily with separatist personnel while gathering intelligence about their operations. The psychological stress of maintaining friendly relationships with enemies of the Republic while planning their destruction was unlike anything his training had prepared him for. But the cover also provided Boss with insights into the human side of the separatist movement that intelligence briefings had never conveyed. The Confederate personnel he worked with weren't the fanatic revolutionaries that Republic propaganda portrayed. They were ordinary beings trying to do their jobs in extraordinary circumstances, many of whom had genuine grievances against the Republic that had led them to support the separatist cause. These personal interactions forced Boss to confront the moral complexities of a war that was far more nuanced than the clear-cut conflict between good and evil that their training had assumed. The separatists weren't evil. They were beings with different political views who had chosen to support a cause they believed in. This realization didn't change his loyalty to the Republic, but it did complicate his understanding of what they were fighting for. Fixer's cover as a computer systems specialist provided him with unprecedented access to separatist information networks, but it also required him to work closely with Confederate technical personnel whose skills and dedication impressed him despite their political allegiances. The separatist engineers weren't the mindless followers of a corrupt cause that Republic propaganda suggested. They were competent professionals who took pride in their work and showed genuine concern for their colleagues' welfare. The cognitive dissonance between propaganda and reality created psychological stress that Fixer channeled into his intelligence-gathering activities. If the separatists were complex beings with legitimate concerns rather than simple enemies, then understanding those concerns became crucial to predicting their actions and exploiting their weaknesses. Scorch's cover as a maintenance technician gave him access to the industrial systems that formed the backbone of the separatist logistics network, but it also exposed him to the economic realities that drove much of the Confederate war effort. The separatist systems he observed weren't the evil empire that Republic rhetoric described. They were functioning societies with their own cultures, economies, and social structures. This exposure to separatist society had a profound impact on Scorch's worldview. His irreverent humor had always been a way of maintaining psychological distance from the darker aspects of military life, but the complexity of what he observed on Ord Mantell challenged his ability to maintain that distance. The beings he was working to defeat weren't monsters. They were people whose lives would be genuinely harmed by his sabotage operations. Sev's surveillance activities provided him with the most intimate view of individual separatist personnel as he tracked their daily routines, personal relationships, and private concerns. What he observed challenged every assumption he had made about enemy psychology and motivation. The separatist officers he monitored weren't the cruel tyrants that Republic intelligence described. They were ordinary beings dealing with the stress of wartime service while trying to maintain their personal relationships and professional responsibilities. They worried about their families, celebrated personal milestones, and showed genuine care for their subordinates' welfare. This humanization of the enemy created psychological conflicts that Sev had never experienced before. His dark humor had always served as a defense mechanism against the emotional impact of taking lives, but it became increasingly difficult to maintain that emotional distance when he understood his targets as complex individuals rather than abstract enemies. The intelligence-gathering phase of the Ord Mantell operation lasted nearly 6 weeks, during which time Delta Squad accumulated more detailed information about separatist logistics operations than Republic intelligence had gathered through conventional means over the previous year. But the psychological cost of the operation was higher than any of them had anticipated. Living undercover for extended periods while maintaining friendly relationships with people they were planning to betray created stress that their training had never addressed. The Commandos had been prepared for the physical dangers of combat and the tactical challenges of complex missions, but they hadn't been prepared for the moral complexities of warfare conducted at the personal level. Boss made the decision to accelerate the sabotage phase of the operation, recognizing that his squad's psychological well-being was being compromised by the extended deception required by their covers. The intelligence they had gathered was valuable, but not valuable enough to justify the mental health costs of prolonged undercover work. The sabotage operations themselves proceeded with characteristic commando efficiency, but they were conducted with less enthusiasm than their previous missions. Scorch's carefully placed devices would cause significant disruption to separatist logistics over the following months, but he took no satisfaction in knowing that his actions would harm beings he had come to know as individuals. The extraction from Ord Mantell was complicated by the personal relationships the Commandos had developed during their time undercover. Simply disappearing would have been operationally clean, but emotionally devastating for the separatist personnel who had come to consider them friends and colleagues. Boss made the difficult decision to maintain their covers until the natural end of their contracted work period, adding weeks to their operation, but allowing them to leave without betraying the personal trust that individual separatists had placed in them. It was a decision that prioritized psychological well-being over operational efficiency, reflecting the kind of human-centered leadership that made commando operations unique. The success of the Ord Mantell operation established new paradigms for how commandos could be used in complex strategic operations, but it also highlighted the psychological costs of using elite soldiers for missions that required extended deception and personal betrayal. The intelligence gathered proved crucial to several subsequent Republic military operations, but the commandos who gathered it carried emotional scars that would affect them for the rest of their service. The lessons learned on Ord Mantell influenced how subsequent deep cover operations would be planned and executed, with greater attention paid to the psychological support requirements of soldiers conducting extended undercover work. But it also established the Commandos as the Republic's premier intelligence gathering asset, capable of obtaining information that conventional intelligence services couldn't access. As 21 BBY progressed, the Commandos found themselves increasingly involved in operations that blurred the traditional boundaries between military action and intelligence work. Their unique combination of combat skills, technical expertise, and psychological training made them ideal for missions that required multiple specialized capabilities integrated into single operations. Omega Squad, operating under Sergeant Niner's leadership, conducted a series of missions that demonstrated how commandos could be used to support broader military campaigns through targeted special operations. Their assignment to the planet Kalura required them to work with local resistance movements while conducting reconnaissance for a planned Republic assault. The Kalura operation represented a different approach to commando missions, one that emphasized working with indigenous populations rather than operating in complete isolation. Niner's leadership style, which emphasized consultation and consensus building, proved particularly effective in building relationships with the Gurlanen resistance fighters who controlled much of the planet's rural areas. Darman's demolitions expertise proved crucial in training resistance fighters to conduct their own sabotage operations, multiplying the effectiveness of Republic special operations by enabling local forces to continue the work after the commandos departed. But the training also required Darman to make difficult decisions about how much advanced technology to share with beings whose ultimate loyalty to the Republic remained uncertain. Fai's medical training became as important as his combat skills as he worked to treat injured resistance fighters while gathering intelligence about separatist medical capabilities and procedures. The dual role of healer and spy created psychological tensions that paralleled those experienced by Delta Squad on Ord Mantell, but Fai's more open emotional nature allowed him to process these conflicts more successfully. Otten's technical skills were crucial in establishing communication networks that allowed the resistance to coordinate their activities while remaining invisible to separatist monitoring systems. But the work also exposed him to the political complexities of the local situation, forcing him to confront questions about the Republic's right to involve neutral populations in galactic conflicts. The success of the Kalura operation established working with local resistance movements as a standard component of commando operations, but it also raised ethical questions about the Republic's use of civilian populations in military operations. The Commandos found themselves serving not just as soldiers, but as diplomats, trainers, and political advisors in situations that required them to make decisions with far-reaching implications for entire planetary populations. These expanded roles require the Commandos to develop skills and perspectives that went far beyond their original training. They were becoming not just elite soldiers, but strategic thinkers capable of understanding and manipulating complex political and social situations. The psychological pressure of these responsibilities was enormous, but it also represented the full realization of the potential that their Mandalorian instructors had seen in them from the beginning. As the second year of the Clone Wars approached, the Commandos had evolved from elite assault troops into comprehensive special operations specialists capable of conducting any mission the Republic could devise. But this evolution had come at a psychological cost that would have long-term implications for their effectiveness and well-being. The brotherhood that had been forged during their training remained strong, but it was now complicated by shared experiences of moral complexity and psychological stress that their instructors had never anticipated. The Commandos were discovering that their greatest enemy wasn't the separatists they fought, but the psychological toll of serving as the Republic's most versatile and effective soldiers. The challenges they faced were only going to increase as the war intensified and their services became even more crucial to the Republic's survival. The galaxy was about to demand even more from these extraordinary soldiers, testing not just their skills and training, but their fundamental understanding of what it meant to serve a cause greater than themselves. The success of operations like Ord Mantell and Kalura had an unintended consequence that Republic military planners hadn't anticipated. The Commandos had become so effective at complex operations that conventional military commanders increasingly refused to conduct missions without commando support. What had begun as an elite special forces capability had evolved into a critical dependency that threatened to overwhelm the limited number of available commando squads. General Obi-Wan Kenobi, reflecting on this phenomenon during a strategy session on Coruscant, observed that the Republic had created soldiers who were almost too good at their jobs. "We've made them so effective," he told the Jedi Council, "that we've forgotten how to accomplish difficult missions without them. That's not sustainable in a war of this scope." The observation highlighted a fundamental problem with the Commando program that had become apparent by mid-21 BBY. The original plan had called for Commando units to conduct special operations that conventional forces couldn't handle, but the reality was that they were increasingly being used for missions that conventional forces could handle but preferred not to attempt because Commando success rates were so much higher. This overuse of Commando capabilities had serious implications for both the individual soldiers and the broader war effort. The Commandos were being pushed to operational tempos that exceeded what their training had prepared them for, conducting back-to-back missions with minimal rest periods between operations. The psychological and physical stress was beginning to show in ways that concerned their medical officers and threatened their long-term effectiveness. Delta Squad, despite their continued success, was showing signs of the strain that came with being the Republic's go-to solution for impossible missions. Boss had developed a slight tremor in his left hand that appeared during mission briefings, a stress response that he carefully concealed from his brothers but couldn't hide from the medical personnel who monitored Commando health. Fixer's rigid adherence to protocol had intensified to the point where it was becoming a liability rather than an asset. His insistence on following established procedures exactly, even in situations where flexibility was required, suggested psychological defense mechanisms that were becoming maladaptive under prolonged stress. Scorch's humor had taken on an edge that his brothers recognized as a warning sign of psychological pressure that was approaching dangerous levels. His jokes were becoming more bitter, his sarcasm more cutting, and his tolerance for the kind of casual interaction that had once characterized squad life was noticeably reduced. Sev's dark worldview had deepened into something that bordered on genuine nihilism, a philosophical outlook that provided him with psychological protection against the moral complexities of their missions, but also isolated him from his brothers in ways that threatened squad cohesion. The psychological strain wasn't limited to Delta Squad. It was appearing throughout the Commando program as these elite soldiers were pushed beyond the limits of what any human could reasonably be expected to endure. Medical personnel reported increased incidents of sleep disorders, anxiety responses, and the kind of hypervigilance that indicated chronic stress reactions. But perhaps more concerning than the individual psychological symptoms was the way that prolonged stress was affecting the brotherhood bonds that formed the foundation of Commando effectiveness. Squads that had previously functioned as perfectly coordinated units were beginning to show signs of internal friction as individual stress responses conflicted with collective needs. Captain Gregor's Foxtrot Group provided a particularly clear example of how operational stress could threaten squad cohesion. Gregor himself was showing signs of the memory problems that would later be attributed to combat-related brain injury, but which were initially manifesting as simple forgetfulness and difficulty with tactical planning. The other members of Foxtrot Group were compensating for Gregor's developing problems in ways that placed additional stress on everyone involved. They were covering for their captain's difficulties while maintaining the appearance of normal operations, but the additional psychological burden was affecting their own performance and well-being. The situation came to a head during a mission to the planet Sarish, where Foxtrot Group was tasked with conducting reconnaissance for a planned Republic assault. The mission should have been routine by Commando standards, but Gregor's cognitive difficulties resulted in tactical decisions that placed his entire squad at unnecessary risk. The Sarish mission became a near disaster that was only salvaged by the extraordinary efforts of Foxtrot Group's other members, but the psychological cost was enormous. The squad was officially listed as missing in action after the battle, though Gregor himself would eventually be recovered and reassigned to different duties. The loss of Foxtrot Group, even temporarily, forced Republic military leadership to confront the reality that their most effective soldiers were being pushed beyond sustainable limits. The Commando program couldn't continue to operate at current intensity levels without risking the complete breakdown of individual squads and the loss of capabilities that couldn't be replaced. The solution that emerged from high-level strategy sessions was both obvious and controversial. The Republic needed more commandos. But creating additional commando squads would require resources and time that the war effort couldn't afford. And it would also require recruiting and training new Mandalorian instructors whose loyalty to the Republic remained questionable. The alternative was to find ways to use existing commando capabilities more efficiently while reducing the operational stress that was threatening the program's long-term viability. This led to the development of new mission parameters that emphasize the unique capabilities that only commandos could provide while avoiding missions that could be accomplished by conventional forces with acceptable casualty rates. Boss found himself increasingly involved in these strategic discussions, as Republic military planners recognized that the commandos themselves had the best understanding of their own capabilities and limitations. His insights into how commando operations could be optimized for maximum strategic impact while minimizing psychological costs proved invaluable in developing new operational doctrines. But Boss's involvement in strategic planning also exposed him to the broader political and military realities that shaped the war effort, knowledge that added another layer of psychological burden to his responsibilities. He was no longer just responsible for his squad's success. He was helping to determine how all commando forces would be used throughout the galaxy. The weight of this responsibility was evident in Boss's leadership style, which began to emphasize mission completion over tactical perfectionism. Where he had once insisted on flawless execution of predetermined plans, he now focused on achieving strategic objectives through whatever means proved most efficient, even if that meant accepting higher risks or less elegant solutions. This evolution in leadership philosophy reflected the broader changes that were occurring throughout the Commando program as these elite soldiers adapted to the realities of a war that exceeded all initial projections. They were being forced to become not just better soldiers, but different soldiers, capable of operating under conditions that no military training could fully prepare them for. Fixer's response to these changing demands was to develop new technical capabilities that could reduce the operational burden on his brothers while maintaining their effectiveness. He began designing automated systems that could handle routine tasks, freeing the commandos to focus on objectives that required their unique skills. His innovations included advanced reconnaissance drones that could gather preliminary intelligence before commando insertion, automated communication systems that could maintain contact with Republic forces without requiring active monitoring, and sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities that could disable enemy systems without requiring physical infiltration. These technical advances represented Fixer's way of caring for his brothers. By reducing the number of dangerous tasks they had to perform personally while maintaining their mission effectiveness. It was a practical expression of the brotherhood bonds that continued to motivate all commando operations despite the stress they were facing. Scorch channeled his growing psychological pressure into developing new demolitions techniques that could accomplish strategic objectives with minimal risk to commando personnel. His innovations focused on delayed action devices that could be placed quickly and safely while producing effects that were precisely calibrated to mission requirements. But more importantly, Scorch began training conventional Republic forces in advanced demolitions techniques, multiplying the Republic's sabotage capabilities while reducing the demand for commando services. His willingness to share specialized knowledge with regular troops reflected his understanding that the war effort was more important than maintaining elite exclusivity. Sev's evolution during this period was perhaps the most dramatic of any commando. His dark worldview, while psychologically protective, had begun to interfere with his ability to function effectively as part of a team. The solution he developed was to channel his nihilistic tendencies into a form of tactical ruthlessness that made him extraordinarily effective at eliminating high-value targets. But Sev's increased lethality came at the cost of emotional connection to his work and his brothers. He was becoming a perfectly efficient killing machine, but he was losing the human qualities that had made him an effective member of Delta Squad. It was a trade-off that concerned his brothers, but one that seemed necessary given the demands they were facing. The changes occurring within individual commandos were reflected in the broader evolution of the program itself. The tight-knit community of elite soldiers that had emerged from Kamino was being transformed by the pressures of sustained combat into something harder and more specialized, but also more fragile and psychologically vulnerable. The brotherhood bonds that had once been sources of strength were becoming sources of additional stress as individual commandos worried about their brothers' well-being while dealing with their own psychological pressures. The mutual dependence that made them so effective in combat was also making them vulnerable to cascading psychological failures that could destroy entire squads. Medical personnel assigned to the Commando program began developing new protocols for monitoring and maintaining the psychological health of these elite soldiers, but the resources available for such care were limited by the war's broader demands. The Commandos were expected to maintain their effectiveness while coping with stress levels that would have incapacitated ordinary soldiers. The solution that emerged was characteristically Commando. They began taking care of each other in ways that went far beyond normal military camaraderie. Squad members developed sophisticated understanding of their brothers' psychological states and learned to provide the kind of emotional support that prevented individual stress from becoming collective breakdown. This mutual care represented the evolution of the brotherhood concept from a tactical advantage into a survival mechanism. The Commandos were learning that their greatest weapon wasn't their training or equipment, but their ability to maintain psychological resilience through collective support. But even this evolved brotherhood had its limits. The loss of Foxtrot Group, even temporarily, demonstrated that there were levels of stress and trauma that could overwhelm even the strongest bonds between brothers. The Commandos were approaching the boundaries of what any soldiers, no matter how elite, could be expected to endure. As 21 BBY drew to a close and the war showed no signs of resolution, the Commandos faced a fundamental question about their future. Could they continue to serve as the Republic's ultimate military asset without losing the essential humanity that made their brotherhood possible? The answer would determine not just their effectiveness as soldiers, but their survival as individuals in a war that was consuming everything it touched. The recognition that the Commando program was approaching unsustainable operational levels led to a fundamental reassessment of how these elite soldiers could be most effectively employed. Rather than continuing to use them as a universal solution to difficult tactical problems, Republic military planners began developing specialized roles that would maximize their unique capabilities while reducing the psychological stress of constant high-stakes operations. This specialization process revealed the full scope of what the Mandalorian training program had actually accomplished. The Commandos weren't just elite soldiers. They were comprehensive military professionals capable of excelling in whatever specialization their natural aptitudes and interests led them toward. The key was matching individual strengths to strategic needs while maintaining the squad cohesion that made them effective. Delta Squad became the template for how this specialization could work in practice. Rather than continuing to serve as general-purpose special operations troops, they were assigned to focus specifically on high-value target elimination and strategic intelligence gathering. Their proven success in these areas made them the obvious choice for missions that required precision and discretion rather than broader tactical capabilities. Boss's evolution into a strategic thinker was formalized through his assignment to Republic intelligence planning sessions, where his operational experience could inform broader military strategy. His insights into Commando capabilities and limitations proved invaluable in developing realistic expectations for what special operations could accomplish within the broader war effort. But Boss's expanded responsibilities also required him to develop diplomatic and political skills that his military training had never addressed. He found himself briefing senators, coordinating with civilian intelligence agencies, and making recommendations that could influence the allocation of resources across multiple sectors of the war effort. This exposure to the political dimensions of the war provided Boss with a broader understanding of what the Republic was fighting for, but it also revealed the moral complexities and bureaucratic inefficiencies that characterized democratic governance during wartime. The clean tactical objectives that defined military operations gave way to political considerations that were far more ambiguous and difficult to navigate. Fixer's technical expertise led to his assignment as the primary liaison between Commando units and the Republic's advanced weapons development programs. His role involved testing prototype equipment under combat conditions while providing feedback that could improve the capabilities available to all special operations forces. This assignment played to Fixer's strengths as both a technical specialist and a perfectionist who could identify flaws in equipment design that might not be apparent under laboratory conditions. His reports led to significant improvements in Commando armor, weapons, and communication systems that enhanced the effectiveness of all special operations units. But Fixer's involvement in weapons development also exposed him to the Republic's military-industrial complex in ways that challenged his understanding of the war effort. He discovered that equipment decisions were often influenced by political and economic considerations rather than purely tactical requirements, creating moral dilemmas about his role in perpetuating a system that prioritized profit over soldier welfare. Scorch's demolitions expertise evolved into a comprehensive understanding of industrial sabotage that made him valuable for missions targeting separatist manufacturing capabilities. His specialization focused on identifying critical vulnerabilities in enemy industrial systems and developing sabotage techniques that could cause maximum disruption with minimal risk to Commando personnel. This work required Scorch to develop expertise in fields ranging from chemical engineering to supply chain management, transforming him from a simple explosives expert into a strategic asset capable of analyzing and disrupting entire industrial economies. His recommendations influenced Republic targeting decisions across multiple sectors of the war. But Scorch's industrial sabotage work also exposed him to the civilian casualties that inevitably resulted from attacking economic targets. The factories he destroyed employed thousands of workers whose lives were disrupted by his actions, creating moral complexities that his irreverent humor couldn't entirely deflect. Sev's marksmanship skills were enhanced through assignment to long-range reconnaissance missions that required him to operate independently for extended periods while gathering intelligence on enemy movements and capabilities. His psychological distance from immediate tactical concerns made him ideal for missions that required patience and analytical observation. Sev's reconnaissance reports provided Republic commanders with detailed intelligence about separatist force dispositions, defensive capabilities, and leadership structures that proved crucial in planning larger military operations. His ability to remain undetected while observing enemy activities for weeks at a time made him one of the Republic's most valuable intelligence assets. But Sev's extended solo operations also increased his psychological isolation from his brothers and from human contact in general. The independence that made him effective at reconnaissance work also made it increasingly difficult for him to maintain the emotional connections that had once anchored his identity within Delta Squad. These individual specializations within Delta Squad were replicated throughout the Commando program, with each squad developing expertise in areas that matched their particular strengths and interests. Omega Squad evolved into specialists in working with local resistance movements, their ability to build relationships with indigenous populations making them invaluable for operations in occupied systems. Niner's leadership style, which emphasized consultation and consensus building, proved particularly effective in managing the complex political dynamics that characterized resistance operations. His ability to navigate competing interests and conflicting loyalties while maintaining focus on military objectives made him one of the Republic's most successful liaison officers. Darman's demolitions work expanded into training programs that taught resistance fighters to conduct their own sabotage operations, multiplying the Republic's special operations capabilities by enabling local forces to continue the work after the commandos departed. His patience and teaching ability made him an effective instructor despite the language and cultural barriers that often complicated such work. Phi's medical training became increasingly important as the war produced larger numbers of casualties requiring specialized care. His combination of combat medicine skills and gentle bedside manner made him valuable not just for treating injured soldiers, but for maintaining morale among Republic forces operating under difficult conditions. Otten's technical skills evolved into comprehensive electronic warfare capabilities that could disrupt enemy communications and coordination across entire planetary systems. His quiet intensity and analytical approach made him particularly effective at the kind of patient, detailed work that electronic warfare required. But the specialization process also revealed the psychological costs of pushing individual commandos toward ever greater expertise in their chosen fields. The broad-based training that had characterized their original development gave way to narrow focus that enhanced their effectiveness, but also reduced their psychological flexibility and resilience. Commandos who had once been capable of handling any mission assignment were becoming specialized tools whose effectiveness was limited to specific types of operations. This specialization made them more valuable for certain missions, but also more vulnerable to psychological breakdown if their specialized roles became unavailable or inappropriate. The recognition of this vulnerability led to the development of rotation policies that ensured commandos could maintain some diversity in their mission assignments while still developing specialized expertise. The goal was to preserve the psychological flexibility that had made them effective while allowing them to develop the specialized skills that the war increasingly demanded. But even these rotation policies couldn't address the fundamental problem that the war was changing faster than the commandos could adapt to meet its demands. The separatists were learning from their defeats and developing countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize Republic's special operations capabilities. The appearance of BX-series droid commandos represented the most direct response to Republic commando effectiveness, but it was just one element of a broader separatist adaptation that included improved security procedures, enhanced surveillance capabilities, and the development of specialized anti-commando tactics. These adaptations forced the Commandos to continuously evolve their own capabilities, staying ahead of enemy countermeasures while maintaining the effectiveness that made them valuable. It was an arms race in miniature, with both sides constantly developing new capabilities designed to counter the other's latest innovations. The psychological stress of this constant adaptation was enormous, requiring the Commandos to continuously learn new skills while unlearning techniques that had become predictable to enemy forces. The stability that had once characterized their professional identities gave way to constant change that tested their psychological resilience in new ways. Delta Squad's response to these challenges demonstrated both their adaptability and the limits of what even elite soldiers could be expected to endure. They successfully adapted to new mission requirements and enemy countermeasures, but the psychological cost was evident in increased tension within the squad and reduced effectiveness in missions that required the kind of perfect coordination they had once achieved effortlessly. The changes were subtle but significant. Boss's tactical decisions became more cautious and less creative. Fixer's adherence to protocol became more rigid and less adaptable. Scorch's humor became more bitter and less effective at maintaining morale. Sev's psychological distance became more pronounced and less compatible with team operations. These individual changes combined to create squad dynamics that were still effective but less harmonious than they had been during their early operations. The brotherhood that had once been a source of strength was becoming a source of stress as individual psychological changes conflicted with collective needs. The medical personnel monitoring Commando health recognized these changes as early indicators of the kind of psychological breakdown that could destroy even the most elite military units. The Commandos were approaching the limits of their psychological resilience, and without intervention, they risked losing the very capabilities that made them valuable. The solution that emerged reflected both the Republic's growing understanding of combat psychology and the unique characteristics of the Commando program. Rather than treating individual psychological problems in isolation, medical personnel began working with entire squads to address the collective stress that was affecting their operations. This approach recognized that Commando effectiveness depended on squad cohesion and that individual psychological health couldn't be separated from collective well-being. The treatment protocols focused on strengthening the brotherhood bonds that had been weakened by prolonged stress, while helping individual Commandos develop better coping mechanisms for the challenges they faced. The success of these psychological support programs demonstrated the importance of understanding Commandos as unique military assets whose effectiveness depended on maintaining their essential humanity despite the dehumanizing pressures of warfare. They couldn't be treated as simple weapons that could be deployed without regard for their psychological well-being. As 20 BBY began, the Commandos had evolved into something unprecedented in military history. Specialized elite soldiers whose effectiveness was maintained through sophisticated psychological support systems that recognized their humanity while enhancing their tactical capabilities. They had become not just better soldiers, but better human beings, capable of maintaining their essential decency despite the moral complexities of the war they were fighting. But the challenges ahead would test this evolution in ways that no one could anticipate. As the war entered its most desperate phase and the very survival of the Republic began to depend on what these extraordinary soldiers could accomplish in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Feel your consciousness drifting with these warriors as they discover what it truly means to be specialists in the art of the impossible, their brotherhood deepening even as the galaxy grows darker around them, their humanity shining brighter even as the shadows of war threaten to consume everything they hold dear. As the Clone Wars reach their most desperate hour, let your mind settle into the rhythm of soldiers who have transcended their original purpose, becoming something both more and less than human. Warriors whose individual identities have merged with their collective destiny, yet who cling fiercely to the bonds that make them more than mere weapons in a galactic conflict. The year 20 BBY marked a turning point in the Clone Wars that few could have anticipated when the conflict began. What had started as a seemingly manageable rebellion had evolved into a total war that consumed entire star systems and threatened the very foundations of galactic civilization. The Separatist Confederacy had proven far more resilient and resourceful than Republic strategists had predicted, while the Republic itself was showing signs of the political and economic strain that prolonged warfare inevitably produced. For the clone commandos, this escalation meant that their specialized capabilities were no longer being used for discrete special operations, but were instead becoming integral components of major military campaigns. They found themselves at the center of battles that would determine the fate of entire sectors, their success or failure having implications that extended far beyond their immediate tactical objectives. But more profoundly, the intensity of these major campaigns was forcing the commandos to confront fundamental questions about their identity and purpose that their training had never fully addressed. They were no longer just elite soldiers following orders. They had become strategic decision-makers whose choices could influence the outcome of galactic conflicts. This transformation brought with it responsibilities and moral complexities that challenged their understanding of what it meant to be soldiers in a democratic society. The Battle of Anaxes represented the culmination of this evolution, a campaign that would demonstrate both the extraordinary capabilities of the Commando program and the psychological costs of pushing these elite soldiers beyond the limits of what any military force had previously attempted. The battle began as a conventional Republic assault on a heavily fortified Separatist stronghold, but it quickly evolved into something far more complex and challenging. The Separatist defense of Anaxes was being coordinated by Admiral Trench, a harsh military genius whose tactical brilliance had frustrated Republic forces across multiple campaigns. Trench's ability to anticipate and counter Republic military strategies had reached almost supernatural levels, suggesting access to intelligence sources that conventional Republic counterintelligence had been unable to identify or neutralize. The mystery of Trench's tactical prescience led to the deployment of Clone Force 99, a commando unit that represented the furthest evolution of the clone program's experimental genetics. Unlike the standard commandos, who were enhanced versions of the basic Jango Fett template, Clone Force 99 consisted of clones whose genetic modifications had produced dramatic deviations from the standard clone phenotype. Hunter, the squad's leader, possessed enhanced sensory capabilities that allowed him to track targets and detect threats with superhuman precision. His leadership style reflected these enhanced senses, emphasizing careful observation and tactical patience rather than the aggressive decisiveness that characterized leaders like Boss or Niner. Tech, the squad's technical specialist, demonstrated intellectual capabilities that exceeded even Fixer's considerable skills. His ability to understand and manipulate complex technological systems approached genius levels, but his social interactions suffered from the kind of focused intensity that made him difficult for normal soldiers to relate to. Wrecker, the squad's heavy weapons specialist, combined enormous physical strength with an almost childlike enthusiasm for combat that masked a sophisticated understanding of battlefield dynamics. His apparent simplicity concealed tactical insights that proved crucial in complex combat situations. Crosshair, the squad's marksman, possessed shooting skills that surpassed even Sev's considerable abilities, but his precision came at the cost of emotional connection to his targets and, increasingly, to his brothers. His clinical approach to elimination missions reflected a psychological distance that was both tactically useful and personally isolating. The genetic deviations that made Clone Force 99 so effective also created social dynamics within the squad that differed significantly from those of standard commando units. Where squads like Delta and Omega had developed their brotherhood through shared training and common experiences, Clone Force 99's bonds were complicated by their individual uniqueness and the way their enhanced abilities set them apart from other clones. But it was precisely these differences that made Clone Force 99 ideal for investigating the mystery of Admiral Trench's tactical success. Their enhanced capabilities and unconventional thinking patterns allowed them to approach the problem from angles that standard military intelligence had never considered. The investigation led to one of the most shocking discoveries of the entire war. ARC Trooper Echo, presumed dead after a mission to the Citadel, was alive and being held by the Separatists. More disturbing still, Echo's cybernetic integration with Separatist computer systems was providing Trench with access to Republic tactical databases and communication networks. The rescue of Echo became a mission that transcended normal military objectives, touching on fundamental questions about clone identity and the lengths to which the Republic would go to save individual soldiers. Echo's physical and psychological transformation during his captivity had changed him in ways that challenged basic assumptions about clone identity and brotherhood. The Echo who was rescued from Separatist captivity bore little resemblance to the enthusiastic young trooper who had served with the 501st Legion. His cybernetic enhancements had saved his life, but had also fundamentally altered his relationship with his own identity and his place within clone society. For Clone Force 99, the integration of Echo into their squad represented both an opportunity and a challenge. Echo's tactical knowledge and cybernetic capabilities enhanced their operational effectiveness, but his psychological trauma and physical modifications created interpersonal dynamics that tested their ability to maintain squad cohesion. Hunter's leadership was crucial in managing this integration, using his enhanced empathy to understand Echo's emotional needs, while helping the rest of the squad adapt to working with someone whose experiences had been so radically different from their own. The process revealed depths to Hunter's emotional intelligence that even his brothers hadn't fully appreciated. Tech's reaction to Echo's cybernetic modifications reflected his own complex relationship with technology and enhancement. While he was fascinated by the technical aspects of Echo's integration with computer systems, he was also disturbed by the involuntary nature of the modifications and their psychological impact. Wrecker's response to Echo was characteristically direct and emotionally honest. He simply accepted Echo as a brother who needed support, focusing on practical ways to help him adapt to his new circumstances rather than dwelling on the philosophical implications of his transformation. Crosshair's reaction was more complex and ultimately more troubling. He saw Echo's modifications as making him less than fully human, a perspective that reflected his own growing psychological distance from emotional connection. This attitude created tension within the squad that would have long-term implications for their cohesion. The successful completion of the Anax's campaign, made possible by Echo's intelligence and Clone Force 99's unique capabilities, demonstrated the potential of Commando forces to influence major military operations. But it also highlighted the psychological costs of pushing individual soldiers beyond normal human limits in pursuit of military objectives. Echo's rescue and integration into Clone Force 99 became a symbol of the broader transformation that was occurring throughout the Commando program. These elite soldiers were being asked to accomplish missions that required them to sacrifice aspects of their humanity in service of military effectiveness, a trade-off that raised fundamental questions about the morality of the war effort. The Anax's campaign also marked the beginning of a deeper exploration of clone identity and culture that would define the final phase of the Clone Wars. The Commandos, with their enhanced training and greater independence, were developing philosophical perspectives on their role in the galaxy that went far beyond simple military service. This cultural evolution was most clearly visible in the way individual commandos began to express their personal identities through modifications to their equipment, armor, and appearance. Where regular clone troopers were required to maintain standardized appearances, commandos were granted greater latitude for personal expression as recognition of their elite status and the importance of maintaining their psychological well-being. Boss began incorporating Mandalorian symbols into his armor design, subtle modifications that reflected his growing connection to the warrior culture that had shaped his training. These changes weren't just decorative. They represented a conscious choice to embrace a cultural identity that went beyond his role as a Republic soldier. Fixer's modifications were more practical than symbolic, focusing on technical enhancements that improve his operational effectiveness. But even these utilitarian changes reflected personal choices about how he wanted to present himself and what capabilities he considered most important to his identity. Scorch's armor modifications reflected his irreverent personality, incorporating designs and colors that expressed his individuality while maintaining the functionality required for combat operations. His personalization represented a form of psychological resistance to the dehumanizing aspects of military service. Sev's modifications were darker and more aggressive, reflecting his psychological evolution toward greater tactical ruthlessness. His armor began to incorporate trophies and markings that documented his combat successes while reinforcing his identity as a professional killer. These individual expressions of identity were occurring throughout the Commando program, creating a visual diversity that stood in stark contrast to the uniformity that characterized regular clone units. But more importantly, they represented a cultural evolution that was transforming the Commandos from simple military assets into a distinct social group with its own values and traditions. The development of this Commando culture was accelerated by their increasing interaction with Mandalorian civilians and warriors who had been displaced by the war. These encounters provided the Commandos with direct exposure to the cultural traditions that had shaped their training, creating opportunities for cultural learning that went far beyond what their instructors had been able to provide. The planet Mandalore itself had become a complex political battlefield, where traditional warrior culture conflicted with the pacifist government that had emerged in response to previous devastating wars. For the Commandos, this conflict represented a microcosm of the broader cultural tensions they were experiencing as they tried to balance their warrior training with their role as defenders of a democratic society. Some Commandos, particularly those who had been trained by more traditional Mandalorian instructors, felt a strong cultural connection to Mandalore and its warrior traditions. They saw themselves as inheritors of a cultural legacy that transcended their military service to the Republic, creating identity conflicts that were both personally meaningful and politically dangerous. Other Commandos, especially those who had developed strong emotional connections to the Republic and its democratic values, viewed Mandalorian culture as an interesting historical influence rather than a contemporary identity. They saw themselves as Republic soldiers first and inheritors of Mandalorian traditions second, if at all. These cultural tensions came to a head during the Siege of Mandalore, a campaign that forced Commandos to choose between their loyalty to the Republic and their cultural connections to Mandalorian independence. The political complexities of the situation made it impossible to maintain neutral positions, requiring individual Commandos to make choices that would define their identities for the rest of their lives. Delta Squad found themselves assigned to support operations during the Mandalore crisis, working alongside Jedi and regular clone units to address threats that were both military and political in nature. The mission required them to operate in an environment where their cultural connections to Mandalorian tradition made them both valuable assets and potential security risks. Boss's growing identification with Mandalorian culture created internal conflicts about his role in operations that might harm Mandalorian independence movements. His tactical decisions during the campaign reflected attempts to accomplish Republic objectives while minimizing damage to Mandalorian civilian populations and cultural institutions. These moral complexities were compounded by the presence of Death Watch extremists whose violent tactics created security threats that required Commando intervention. The Commandos found themselves in the position of fighting against Mandalorians whose warrior traditions were similar to their own, creating psychological stress that challenged their understanding of their cultural identity. Fixer approached these cultural conflicts with his characteristic analytical detachment, focusing on the technical requirements of their missions, while avoiding the emotional implications of fighting against beings who shared their cultural heritage. His psychological coping mechanism was to treat cultural considerations as irrelevant to tactical decision-making. Scorch used his humor to deflect the emotional impact of the cultural conflicts, making jokes about the irony of Mandalorian-trained soldiers fighting against Mandalorian independence. But his humor couldn't entirely mask his genuine discomfort with the moral ambiguities of the situation. Seth's response was more direct and ultimately more troubling. He embraced the ruthless efficiency that the situation seemed to require, treating cultural considerations as weaknesses that interfered with mission accomplishment. His psychological distance from emotional connection allowed him to operate effectively, but at the cost of further isolation from his brothers. The resolution of the Mandalore crisis left the Commandos with a clearer understanding of their cultural identity, but also with a greater appreciation for the moral complexities of their role in the galaxy. They had learned that cultural heritage could be both a source of strength and a source of conflict, and that their elite status carried responsibilities that extended beyond simple military effectiveness. But perhaps more importantly, the Mandalore campaign had demonstrated that the Commandos were capable of making independent moral judgments about their role in galactic conflicts. They were no longer simply following orders. They were making conscious choices about how to balance competing loyalties and conflicting values. This evolution toward greater moral autonomy was both an asset and a potential liability for the Republic. Commandos who could think independently and make ethical judgments were more effective in complex situations that required tactical flexibility and cultural sensitivity. But they were also less predictable and less controllable than soldiers who simply followed orders without question. The tension between independence and obedience would become increasingly important as the war entered its final phase and the political pressures on both sides of the conflict reached critical levels. The Commandos were about to face challenges that would test not just their military capabilities, but their fundamental loyalties and their understanding of what they were fighting for. As 19BBY began, the Clone Wars had evolved into something that none of its original participants had anticipated. The clear-cut conflict between democracy and tyranny that had characterized the war's beginning had given way to a complex struggle involving competing visions of galactic governance, cultural identity, and individual freedom. For the clone Commandos, this evolution meant that their role was no longer simply military, but political, cultural, and moral as well. They were being asked to serve as the Republic's representatives in situations where military force was just one tool among many for accomplishing strategic objectives. The psychological pressure of these expanded responsibilities was enormous, requiring the Commandos to develop skills and perspectives that their training had never anticipated. They were becoming not just elite soldiers, but cultural ambassadors, political advisors, and moral philosophers whose decisions could influence the fate of entire civilizations. But they were also approaching the limits of what any soldiers, no matter how elite, could be expected to accomplish. The war was demanding sacrifices of them that went beyond physical courage or tactical brilliance, requiring them to surrender aspects of their humanity in service of objectives that were becoming increasingly difficult to understand or justify. The brotherhood that had sustained them through their earlier challenges was being tested by these new pressures in ways that threatened its fundamental integrity. Individual Commandos were being pulled in different directions by competing loyalties and conflicting values, creating interpersonal tensions that challenged the unity that had made them effective. But even as these pressures mounted, the Commandos continued to demonstrate the extraordinary capabilities that had made them valuable to the Republic. Their success in major campaigns like Anax's and Mandalore proved that they remain the galaxy's most effective special operations forces, capable of accomplishing missions that conventional forces couldn't even attempt. The question that remained was whether they could maintain their effectiveness while preserving the essential humanity that made their brotherhood possible. The war was about to demand answers to that question in ways that would test everything they had learned about themselves and their place in the galaxy. The challenges ahead would require them to choose between loyalty and conscience, between effectiveness and morality, between brotherhood and individual survival. The choices they made would determine not just their own fate, but the kind of galaxy that would emerge from the ashes of the Clone Wars. As the final year of the Clone Wars unfolded, The galaxy found itself consumed by a level of violence and destruction that exceeded even the most pessimistic predictions made at the conflict's beginning. Entire star systems had been depopulated by the fighting, ancient civilizations had been reduced to rubble, and the economic infrastructure that supported galactic commerce had been severely damaged by 3 years of total warfare. For the clone Commandos, this escalation meant that they were no longer operating on the periphery of major conflicts, but were instead becoming central figures in battles that would determine the war's ultimate outcome. Their specialized capabilities had evolved from useful supplements to conventional military operations into essential components of the Republic's survival strategy. But this increasing importance came at a psychological cost that was becoming more apparent with each passing month. The Commandos were being asked to accomplish objectives that pushed them beyond the boundaries of conventional military ethics, requiring them to make decisions that conventional soldiers would never be expected to face. The mission that perhaps best exemplified these moral complexities was the assignment given to Omega Squad to infiltrate and sabotage the Separatist research facility on Megiddo. The facility was believed to be developing new weapons technologies that could tip the balance of the war decisively in favor of the Confederacy, making its destruction a strategic imperative for the Republic. But the facility was also located in a heavily populated civilian area, and its destruction would inevitably cause significant collateral damage to non-combatant populations who had no direct involvement in the war effort. The mission required the Commandos to weigh the strategic value of their objective against the moral cost of civilian casualties. Niner, as Omega Squad's leader, bore the primary responsibility for making this calculation. His consultative leadership style, which had proved so effective in building relationships with resistance movements, was less suited to situations that required decisive action in the face of moral ambiguity. The tactical planning sessions for the Megiddo mission revealed the depth of the psychological pressure that all Commandos were experiencing. Darman's demolitions expertise made him the natural choice for determining how the facility could be destroyed, but his growing emotional maturity made him acutely aware of the civilian casualties his actions would cause. Phi's medical training provided him with detailed knowledge of the injuries that would result from the kind of explosive effects necessary to destroy the facility, creating mental images of suffering that his compassionate nature found difficult to accept. His role as the squad's emotional anchor was compromised by his own moral distress about the mission. Otten's technical analysis of the facility's systems revealed potential approaches that could minimize civilian casualties, but these alternatives would significantly reduce the likelihood of mission success while increasing the risks to the squad itself. His quiet intensity reflected the internal struggle between tactical effectiveness and moral responsibility. The solution that emerged from these planning sessions reflected the kind of creative problem-solving that had always characterized commando operations, but it also demonstrated how these elite soldiers were evolving beyond simple military thinking toward more complex moral reasoning. Rather than conducting a straightforward demolition operation, Omega Squad developed a plan that would evacuate civilian populations under the cover of a simulated industrial accident before conducting their actual sabotage operation. The approach required significantly more time and resources than a direct assault, but it allowed them to accomplish their strategic objective while minimizing harm to non-combatants. The execution of this plan required the Commandos to function not just as soldiers, but as disaster relief coordinators, helping to organize civilian evacuations while maintaining their operational cover. Their training in working with local populations proved invaluable, but the emotional stress of deceiving people they were trying to help created psychological burdens that were difficult to bear. The success of the Megiddo operation established new paradigms for how commando operations could balance military effectiveness with moral responsibility, but it also highlighted the increasing complexity of the ethical decisions these soldiers were being required to make. They were no longer just following orders. They were actively choosing how to interpret and implement those orders in ways that reflected their own moral judgments. This evolution toward greater moral autonomy was occurring throughout the Commando program, as individual soldiers and entire squads developed their own approaches to managing the ethical complexities of their assignments. Some commandos, like Boss, began incorporating formal ethical analysis into their mission planning, creating systematic approaches to balancing competing moral claims. Others, like Sev, moved in the opposite direction, embracing a utilitarian calculus that prioritized mission success over all other considerations. This approach reduced the psychological stress of moral decision-making, but also created interpersonal tensions within squads whose other members maintained more complex ethical perspectives. The diversity of approaches to moral reasoning within the Commando program reflected the broader cultural evolution that was transforming these soldiers from simple military assets into autonomous moral agents. They were developing individual consciences and ethical frameworks that sometimes conflicted with military orders and institutional expectations. This transformation was accelerated by their increasing exposure to the political dimensions of the war effort. As the Commandos became more involved in strategic planning and high-level decision-making, they gained access to information about the broader context of their missions that regular soldiers never received. Boss's participation in Republic intelligence briefings exposed him to classified information about the war's political objectives and the civilian leadership's strategic thinking. This knowledge gave him a broader perspective on how individual missions fit into larger strategic goals, but it also revealed the extent to which military operations were being driven by political considerations rather than purely tactical requirements. The intelligence briefings revealed that many Commando missions were being designed not just to accomplish specific tactical objectives, but to influence public opinion, demonstrate Republic resolve, or send political messages to potential allies and enemies. The Commandos were being used as instruments of political communication as much as military action. This politicization of their missions created new forms of psychological stress for soldiers whose training had emphasized clear tactical objectives and measurable success criteria. They were being asked to evaluate their effectiveness, not just in terms of mission completion, but in terms of political impact that they were often not qualified to assess. Fixer's involvement in weapons development programs provided him with a different perspective on the war's political dimensions, as he observed how equipment decisions were influenced by economic and bureaucratic considerations rather than purely technical requirements. His perfectionist nature was frustrated by systems that prioritized cost and political acceptability over optimal performance. The weapons development process revealed the extent to which the Republic's war effort was constrained by democratic political processes that required consensus building and compromise rather than optimal decision-making. While these processes reflected democratic values that the Commandos were fighting to defend, they also created inefficiencies that cost lives and reduced military effectiveness. Scorch's industrial sabotage work exposed him to the economic foundations of the war effort on both sides of the conflict. His missions targeted not just military installations, but civilian infrastructure that supported enemy war production, creating moral complexities about the targeting of economic rather than purely military objectives. The economic warfare that Scorch was conducting required him to understand the civilian populations whose livelihoods depended on the industries he was destroying. His irreverent humor became a defense mechanism against the guilt he felt about harming beings whose only crime was working in industries that supported their government's war efforts. Sev's reconnaissance missions provided him with the most intimate view of enemy populations and the civilian cost of the war. His extended observations of separatist-controlled territories revealed the extent to which ordinary beings were suffering from the conflict regardless of their political loyalties or military involvement. These observations challenged Sev's increasingly utilitarian approach to moral reasoning, forcing him to confront the human consequences of the strategic objectives he was helping to accomplish. His psychological response was to increase his emotional distance from these observations, treating them as tactical intelligence rather than moral information. But even Sev's psychological defenses couldn't entirely protect him from the cumulative impact of witnessing so much suffering caused by actions he had participated in. His dark humor became more bitter and less effective at maintaining his psychological balance, while his relationships with his brothers became more distant and less emotionally supportive. These individual psychological changes were occurring throughout the Commando program, creating interpersonal dynamics within squads that were more complex and less harmonious than they had been during the war's earlier phases. The brotherhood that had once been a source of uncomplicated support was becoming complicated by moral disagreements and conflicting approaches to ethical reasoning. Delta Squad's internal dynamics reflected these broader changes in ways that threatened their effectiveness as a combat unit. Boss's growing emphasis on ethical analysis sometimes conflicted with tactical requirements, creating delays in decision-making that could be dangerous in combat situations. Fixer's frustration with political and bureaucratic constraints made him less willing to accept mission parameters that he considered suboptimal, leading to tensions with command authorities that complicated their operational relationships. His rigid adherence to what he considered proper procedures sometimes conflicted with the flexibility that complex missions required. Scorch's guilt about the civilian consequences of his sabotage work made him less enthusiastic about Demolition's missions, reducing the effectiveness that had made him valuable while creating emotional burdens that affected his relationships with his brothers. Sev's increasing emotional distance made him less responsive to his brother's attempts at emotional support and coordination, threatening the perfect understanding that had once made Delta Squad so effective in combat. His tactical ruthlessness was becoming a liability to squad cohesion, even as it enhanced his individual effectiveness. These interpersonal tensions were manageable during routine operations, but they created serious risks during high-stress combat situations where perfect coordination could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The Commandos were discovering that psychological evolution could be both an asset and a liability, depending on the specific requirements of their assignments. The medical personnel monitoring Commando psychological health recognized these changes as natural responses to prolonged exposure to moral complexity and combat stress, but they were also concerned about the potential for individual psychological breakdown that could destroy entire squads. The psychological support programs that had been developed to maintain Commando effectiveness were expanded to address these new forms of stress, focusing on helping individual soldiers and entire squads develop healthy approaches to moral reasoning that could preserve their effectiveness while maintaining their psychological well-being. These programs emphasize the importance of maintaining the brotherhood bonds that had always been the foundation of Commando effectiveness, while also acknowledging the legitimacy of individual moral reasoning and ethical development. The goal was to preserve squad cohesion while allowing for individual growth and moral autonomy. But even the most sophisticated psychological support programs couldn't address the fundamental problem that the Commandos were being asked to function in roles that exceeded what any soldiers, no matter how elite, could reasonably be expected to handle. They were serving simultaneously as combat troops, intelligence operatives, political advisors, moral philosophers, and cultural ambassadors in situations that would challenge the capabilities of entire government departments. The recognition of these limitations led to discussions about the future role of commando forces in the Republic's military structure, but these conversations were interrupted by events that would make such long-term planning irrelevant. The war was approaching its climax, and the Commandos were about to face challenges that would test everything they had learned about themselves and their place in the galaxy. As 19 BBY reached its midpoint, the political situation in the Republic was becoming increasingly unstable. Chancellor Palpatine's accumulation of emergency powers had created a concentration of authority that many observers considered dangerous to democratic governance, while the economic costs of the war were creating social pressures that threatened the Republic's internal stability. For the Commandos, these political developments created additional uncertainty about their role and future. They had been created to serve the Republic, but the Republic they were serving was changing in ways that challenged their understanding of what they were fighting for. The question of loyalty was about to become more than academic, as events were set in motion that would force every clone trooper to choose between competing claims of duty and allegiance. The Commandos, with their enhanced training and greater independence, would face these choices with a clarity of understanding that made their decisions both more informed and more consequential. The brotherhood that had sustained them through 3 years of warfare was about to be tested by challenges that would determine not just their individual survival, but the kind of beings they would choose to become in a galaxy forever changed by the Clone Wars. Let yourself sink deeper into the darkness between battles, feeling the weight of these impossible choices, the burden of excellence that demands more than any soul should bear, yet knowing that somewhere in that darkness, the light of brotherhood still burns, still offers hope in a galaxy spinning toward its darkest hour. In the closing months of 19 BBY, as the Clone Wars reached their crescendo, the galaxy witnessed military operations of unprecedented scale and complexity. Entire sectors were being contested in campaigns that involved millions of soldiers and thousands of warships, while the industrial output of entire star systems was being devoted to war production on both sides of the conflict. Within this vast theater of operations, the clone commandos found their specialized capabilities in demand for missions that would have been inconceivable at the war's beginning. They were no longer supporting conventional military operations. They were conducting strategic campaigns that could determine the fate of entire regions of the galaxy. The Outer Rim sieges represented the culmination of this evolution, a coordinated series of assaults designed to break the back of separatist military power by capturing or destroying their most important industrial and military centers. For the Commandos, these campaigns meant months of continuous operations under conditions that tested every aspect of their training and psychological resilience. Delta Squad found themselves assigned to the siege of Felucia, a jungle world whose dense vegetation and hostile environment made it ideal for the kind of extended guerrilla warfare that played to Commando strengths. But the campaign also required them to work closely with regular clone units whose tactical approaches and psychological makeup differed significantly from their own. The integration of Commando capabilities with conventional military operations created new challenges that hadn't been addressed during their original training. The Commandos have been designed to operate independently, making their own tactical decisions based on their assessment of battlefield conditions. Working within larger military structures required them to subordinate their tactical judgment to overall campaign objectives that they might not fully understand or agree with. Boss found himself serving not just as Delta Squad's leader, but as a liaison between Commando forces and the conventional military commanders who were directing the overall campaign. This role required diplomatic skills that his military training had never emphasized, as he worked to explain Commando capabilities and limitations to officers who had little understanding of special operations. The challenge was complicated by the fact that many conventional commanders viewed the Commandos with a mixture of admiration and resentment. They respected their tactical effectiveness, but were frustrated by their independence and their reluctance to accept orders that they considered tactically unsound or morally questionable. These tensions came to a head during the siege of a separatist fortress complex that commanded a strategic river valley on Felucia. The conventional plan called for a direct assault that would likely succeed, but would also result in heavy casualties among regular clone units. Delta Squad proposed an alternative approach that would eliminate the fortress with minimal casualties, but would require several days of careful preparation. The debate over tactical approaches reflected broader philosophical differences between Commando and conventional military thinking. The regular commanders were focused on achieving objectives quickly and decisively, accepting casualties as an inevitable cost of military success. The Commandos prioritized mission accomplishment with minimal losses, viewing unnecessary casualties as tactical failures rather than acceptable costs. Boss's advocacy for the Commando approach required him to challenge the tactical judgment of superior officers, something that his military training had taught him to avoid. But his responsibility to his brothers and to the clone units who would be casualties of the conventional assault made him willing to risk disciplinary action rather than remain silent. The resolution of the tactical dispute came when Jedi General Aayla Secura supported the Commando approach, recognizing that the preservation of clone lives was more important than rapid objective completion. Her intervention demonstrated the crucial role that Jedi leadership played in mediating between different military perspectives within the Republic forces. The successful execution of Delta Squad's alternative plan validated their tactical approach, while also demonstrating their ability to integrate their specialized capabilities with larger military operations. The fortress was eliminated with minimal casualties, and the tactical lessons learned were applied to subsequent operations throughout the Outer Rim sieges. But the campaign also revealed the psychological costs of extended combat operations for soldiers whose training had emphasized short-duration, high-intensity missions. The Commandos were being asked to maintain their tactical effectiveness over periods of months rather than days or weeks, creating stress that their original training hadn't anticipated. Fixer's response to these extended operations was to develop increasingly elaborate technical systems that could automate routine tasks and reduce the cognitive burden on human operators. His innovations included advanced sensor networks that could monitor large areas with minimal human oversight, automated communication systems that could coordinate multiple units without constant human intervention, and sophisticated data analysis programs that could identify tactical patterns and opportunities. These technical innovations were crucial to maintaining Commando effectiveness during extended operations, but they also reflected Fixer's psychological need to maintain control over increasingly complex and chaotic situations. His perfectionist nature required systems that functioned with mechanical precision, even when those systems were supporting inherently unpredictable human activities. Scorch's adaptation to extended operations involved developing new demolitions techniques that could create long-term strategic effects rather than immediate tactical results. His innovations included delayed action devices that could disrupt enemy supply lines weeks after their installation, environmental modifications that could channel enemy movements into predetermined killing zones, and infrastructure sabotage that could cripple enemy industrial capabilities without immediate detection. These techniques required Scorch to think strategically rather than tactically, considering the long-term implications of his actions rather than just their immediate battlefield effects. The intellectual challenge of this strategic thinking provided him with psychological engagement that helped offset the emotional stress of extended combat operations. Sev's role during the extended campaigns evolved beyond simple marksmanship toward comprehensive battlefield intelligence gathering. His reconnaissance capabilities were expanded to include detailed analysis of enemy behavioral patterns, assessment of civilian population dynamics, and evaluation of environmental factors that could influence long-term tactical planning. This intelligence work required Sev to spend weeks at a time in isolated observation positions, maintaining surveillance of enemy activities while avoiding detection by increasingly sophisticated separatist counter-reconnaissance efforts. The isolation was both tactically valuable and psychologically challenging, as it required him to function effectively without the social support that had previously sustained his psychological well-being. The psychological pressure of these extended solo operations was evident in Sev's increasingly detached communication style and his growing reluctance to engage in the casual interaction that had once characterized Delta Squad's internal dynamics. His brothers were concerned about his psychological state, but their own operational responsibilities left them with limited ability to provide the support he needed. The culmination of these individual adaptations came during the final assault on the primary separatist stronghold on Felucia, a complex operation that required perfect coordination between all members of Delta Squad while integrating their efforts with those of multiple conventional units and Jedi commanders. The operation began with Sev's reconnaissance revealing that the separatist defenders had prepared a series of defensive positions that would make conventional assault extremely costly. His intelligence indicated that the fortress could only be captured through a coordinated attack that neutralized these positions simultaneously, requiring tactical precision that exceeded normal military capabilities. Fixer's technical analysis revealed that the fortress's defensive systems were controlled by a central computer network that could be accessed through carefully placed electronic warfare devices. His plan called for infiltrating multiple locations simultaneously while maintaining perfect coordination to avoid triggering security systems that would alert the defenders. Scorch's demolitions plan complemented Fixer's electronic warfare by identifying structural vulnerabilities that could be exploited to create cascading failures throughout the fortress's defensive network. His charges would need to be placed with perfect timing to create the maximum disruption while avoiding the kind of massive destruction that might harm Republic forces during their assault. Boss's role was to coordinate these individual specializations into a unified operational plan while managing the integration with conventional forces whose success depended on the Commando's ability to eliminate the fortress's defensive capabilities. The complexity of the coordination required tactical decision-making that pushed his leadership abilities to their limits. The successful execution of this complex operation demonstrated the full evolution of Commando capabilities from simple special operations troops to comprehensive strategic assets capable of influencing major military campaigns. But it also revealed the psychological costs of pushing individual soldiers beyond normal human limits in pursuit of military objectives. The victory on Fallujah was followed immediately by reassignment to the Battle of Kashyyyk, where Delta Squad would face their final major operation of the Clone Wars. The jungle world of the Wookiees presented environmental challenges that were different from, but equally demanding as those they had faced on Fallujah. The Kashyyyk campaign was notable for its integration of indigenous forces with Republic military units, as Wookiee warriors fought alongside clone troopers in defense of their homeworld. For the Commandos, this meant working with non-human allies whose combat capabilities and cultural perspectives differed significantly from anything they had previously experienced. The Wookiees' natural strength and intimate knowledge of their jungle environment made them valuable allies, but their warrior culture and emotional approach to combat created coordination challenges that required careful management. Delta Squad's experience working with diverse populations during their previous campaigns proved invaluable in building effective relationships with Wookiee military leaders. Boss's diplomatic skills were crucial in negotiating tactical agreements that respected Wookiee cultural values while accomplishing Republic military objectives. The Wookiees' emotional investment in defending their homeworld sometimes conflicted with tactical requirements for strategic withdrawal or calculated risk-taking, requiring sensitive handling of competing priorities. Fixer's technical capabilities were enhanced by Wookiee engineering knowledge, as the indigenous population provided insights into jungle warfare techniques and environmental manipulation that complemented his systematic approach to problem-solving. The collaboration produced innovations that proved valuable throughout the campaign. Scorch found that Wookiee craftsmanship traditions included sophisticated understanding of explosive techniques that enhanced his own demolitions capabilities. Working with Wookiee artisans, he developed new approaches to environmental modification that could create tactical advantages while respecting the Wookiees' cultural reverence for their natural environment. Seth's reconnaissance work was complicated by the jungle environment, but was enhanced by Wookiee knowledge of wildlife behavior and natural camouflage techniques. His ability to remain undetected during extended observation missions was improved through integration of indigenous hunting practices with his technological capabilities. The successful defense of Kashyyyk represented the culmination of the Commandos' evolution during the Clone Wars, demonstrating their ability to function effectively in any environment while working with any allies in pursuit of Republic objectives. But it also marked the end of an era, as events were being set in motion that would fundamentally transform the nature of their service. As the Battle of Kashyyyk reached its conclusion, Delta Squad received orders that would take them away from the main combat zone for what appeared to be a routine extraction mission. They were tasked with recovering important personnel from a contested area, the kind of mission they had conducted countless times during their years of service. But the mission would prove to be anything but routine, as it would place them at the center of events that would transform the Republic into the Empire and in the Clone Wars in ways that no one had anticipated. The brotherhood that had sustained them through years of combat was about to face its ultimate test, as the galaxy they had fought to defend was transformed into something they no longer recognized. The extraction mission proceeded normally initially, with Delta Squad using their proven techniques for infiltration and recovery in hostile territory. But as they prepared to complete their objective and return to friendly lines, they received a communication that would change everything. Execute Order 66. The order, transmitted with proper authentication codes and command authority, instructed all clone units to eliminate their Jedi commanders immediately. For the Commandos, who had developed close working relationships with Jedi throughout their service, the order represented a fundamental challenge to their understanding of their role and their loyalties. Boss received the order while working directly with Jedi Master Yoda, whose wisdom and leadership had earned the respect of all clone forces on Kashyyyk. The order required him to betray and kill a being who had shown nothing but concern for clone welfare and had consistently demonstrated the values that the Republic claimed to represent. Fixer's analytical mind immediately recognized the tactical implications of Order 66, as eliminating Jedi commanders would disrupt Republic military operations across the galaxy. His systematic approach to problem-solving made him question whether the order represented legitimate command authority or some form of enemy deception. Scorch's emotional response to the order was immediate and negative, as his irreverent humor had often been directed at military authority rather than the Jedi, who had consistently treated clones with respect and dignity. His instinctive reaction was to reject an order that contradicted his understanding of right and wrong. Sev's psychological distance from emotional attachment made him less troubled by the moral implications of Order 66, but his tactical analysis suggested that eliminating Jedi would reduce rather than enhance military effectiveness. His utilitarian calculus indicated that the order was strategically counterproductive regardless of its political justification. The moment of decision that followed the transmission of Order 66 represented the ultimate test of everything the Commandos had learned about loyalty, brotherhood, and moral reasoning during their years of service. They had to choose between following orders and following their consciences, between institutional loyalty and personal integrity. The choice they made would determine not just their own fate, but their understanding of what it meant to be soldiers in a galaxy where the very nature of the government they served was being fundamentally transformed. The Clone Wars were ending, but the real test of the Commando Brotherhood was just beginning. Close your eyes and feel the weight of that impossible moment, when everything these warriors had believed in hung in the balance, when the choice between duty and conscience would define not just their survival, but their souls. The final months before Order 66 saw the emergence of something unprecedented in galactic military history, a distinct clone commando culture that transcended their origins as military assets and approached something resembling a genuine civilization in miniature. This culture had evolved organically from the intersection of Mandalorian training traditions, Republic military service, and the unique experiences that came from serving as the galaxy's most elite soldiers. The physical manifestations of this cultural evolution were visible in every aspect of Commando life. Their armor, once uniform and standardized, had become canvases for personal expression that told the story of individual journeys through the war. Each Commando's equipment reflected not just tactical preferences, but philosophical perspectives on their role and identity. The colors and symbols that adorned Commando armor carried meanings that went far beyond simple decoration. Mandalorian mythosaur skulls appeared alongside Republic military insignia, creating visual representations of the cultural tensions that shaped Commando identity. Personal kill counts, unit affiliations, and memorial markings for fallen brothers created a complex iconography that told stories of sacrifice, brotherhood, and individual achievement. But perhaps more significantly, the Commandos had developed their own language, not just the tactical communication codes that all military units used, but a rich vocabulary of slang, references, and cultural expressions that reflected their unique experiences and perspectives. This language served both practical and psychological functions, allowing commandos to communicate complex tactical and emotional concepts efficiently while reinforcing their group identity. The phrase "vode" and borrowed from their Mandalorian heritage, had evolved from a simple war chant into something approaching a fundamental philosophical statement about the nature of brotherhood and sacrifice. When commandos said "vode" and to each other, they weren't just acknowledging their shared genetic heritage. They were affirming their commitment to values that transcended military duty. The concept of beer, the Mandalorian term for parent or father, had been adapted by the commandos to refer to their training sergeants and squad leaders in ways that recognized emotional as well as command relationships. This linguistic adaptation reflected the evolution of military hierarchy into something more resembling family structure, with all the emotional complexity that such relationships entailed. The development of commando cultural practices extended beyond language into rituals and traditions that gave meaning to their shared experiences. Memorial ceremonies for fallen brothers became elaborate affairs that combined military honors with Mandalorian warrior traditions and personal expressions of grief and remembrance. These ceremonies served crucial psychological functions for soldiers whose intense brotherhood bonds made the loss of any squad member a devastating personal tragedy. The rituals provided structured ways to process grief while reinforcing the cultural values that made their sacrifice meaningful. The celebration of successful missions also evolved into cultural practices that went far beyond simple military debriefings. Commandos developed traditions of storytelling that preserved tactical knowledge while also creating shared narratives about their role and identity. These stories served educational functions for new commandos while reinforcing cultural values for veterans. The food culture that emerged among commando units reflected both their Mandalorian heritage and their adaptation to military service conditions. Ration preparation became an art form that allowed for personal expression while maintaining the practical requirements of field operations. Commandos developed elaborate techniques for enhancing standard military rations with locally sourced ingredients, creating meals that served social and cultural functions as well as nutritional needs. The sharing of food became a ritual of brotherhood that reinforced squad bonds while providing opportunities for informal discussion of tactical and personal concerns. These mealtimes served as informal counseling sessions where commandos could address psychological stress and interpersonal conflicts in supportive environments. The musical traditions that developed among commando units provided another outlet for cultural expression and emotional processing. Working songs adapted from Mandalorian tradition helped coordinate group activities while reinforcing cultural identity. Personal compositions allowed individual commandos to express emotional experiences that were difficult to communicate through normal conversation. These musical traditions served particularly important functions during extended campaigns where maintaining morale and psychological health required active cultural engagement. The songs provided emotional release while reinforcing the values and relationships that made military service meaningful. The technological innovations that emerged from commando culture represented another form of cultural expression that had practical applications. Commandos developed modifications to their equipment that reflected both tactical requirements and aesthetic preferences, creating personalized tools that enhanced their effectiveness while expressing their individual identities. These modifications went far beyond simple customization to represent genuine technological innovation that influenced the development of military equipment throughout the Republic forces. Commando developed improvements to armor, weapons, and communication systems were adopted by regular clone units and even civilian organizations. The intellectual culture that developed among commandos reflected their enhanced education and the complex nature of their mission assignments. Book clubs and discussion groups became common features of commando units, providing opportunities for intellectual engagement that went beyond tactical training. These intellectual activities served important psychological functions for soldiers whose intelligence and education exceeded that of typical military personnel. The discussions provided mental stimulation while also allowing commandos to explore philosophical and ethical questions related to their service. The artistic expressions that emerge from commando culture range from traditional Mandalorian crafts to contemporary forms that reflected their unique experiences. Sculpture, painting, and other visual arts provided outlets for emotional expression while creating cultural artifacts that preserve their experiences for future generations. These artistic activities were particularly important for commandos whose combat experiences included traumatic events that were difficult to process through normal psychological mechanisms. Art provided alternative ways to understand and express experiences that couldn't be easily communicated through language. The religious and philosophical practices that developed within commando culture reflected the complex moral and existential questions that arose from their service. Some commandos embraced traditional Mandalorian spiritual practices, while others developed personal philosophical frameworks that helped them understand their role and purpose. These spiritual practices provided psychological anchoring that helped commandos maintain their sense of identity and purpose despite the moral complexities of their service. The philosophical frameworks they developed influenced their tactical decision-making while also providing guidance for personal relationships and ethical choices. The leadership traditions that emerged within commando culture represented adaptations of both military and Mandalorian models to the unique requirements of elite special operations. Commando leaders developed approaches that combined tactical authority with emotional support, creating command structures that enhanced both military effectiveness and psychological well-being. These leadership approaches influenced the development of command practices throughout the Republic military, as conventional officers observed the superior morale and effectiveness that characterized commando units. The integration of emotional intelligence with tactical competence became a model for military leadership that extended far beyond special operations. The educational practices that developed within commando units reflected their role as repositories of specialized knowledge and expertise. Senior commandos developed informal mentoring programs that passed tactical knowledge and cultural values to newer squad members while also providing psychological support during the adaptation process. These educational activities created learning communities that enhanced both individual and collective capabilities while reinforcing the cultural values that made commando service meaningful. The knowledge preservation functions of these programs ensured that tactical innovations and cultural traditions would survive personnel changes and mission rotations. The medical and psychological support traditions that emerged within commando culture represented adaptations of both military and civilian practices to the unique stresses of elite special operations service. Commandos developed informal counseling networks that provided peer support for psychological challenges while also maintaining the operational security requirements of their classified missions. These support networks were crucial for maintaining the psychological health of soldiers whose service involved moral complexities and emotional stresses that exceeded normal military experience. The peer counseling approaches they developed influenced the evolution of military mental health services throughout the Republic forces. The recreational activities that became part of commando culture provided necessary psychological relief, while also reinforcing squad bonds and cultural values. Physical competitions, strategic games, and social activities created opportunities for relaxation and relationship building that were essential for maintaining morale during extended campaigns. These recreational traditions served important functions for soldiers whose operational tempo often left little time for personal relationships and individual interests. The structured social activities provided controlled opportunities for emotional expression and interpersonal bonding that enhanced both individual well-being and squad effectiveness. By the final months of 19 BBY, the clone commandos had evolved far beyond their original conception as enhanced military assets. They had become a genuine cultural community with its own values, traditions, and institutions that provided meaning and identity that transcended their their military function. This cultural evolution represented both an achievement and a vulnerability. The rich cultural life that had developed among the Commandos provided psychological resources that enhanced their resilience and effectiveness, but it also created emotional investments and loyalties that complicated their relationship with military authority and institutional objectives. The question of whether this cultural evolution represented a positive development or a threat to military discipline was about to be tested by events that would challenge everything the Commandos had built during their years of service. The galaxy was changing in ways that would force them to choose between their cultural identity and their institutional loyalty, between the brotherhood they had created and the orders they were sworn to follow. As the Clone Wars approached their climactic end, the Commandos faced a fundamental question about the future of the culture they had created. Could it survive the transformation of the Republic into something they no longer recognized, or would it be consumed by the political forces that were reshaping the galaxy? The answer would determine not just their own fate, but the preservation of values and traditions that represented some of the best aspects of what the Republic had claimed to defend. The culture they had created through years of shared sacrifice and brotherhood was about to face its ultimate test. Allow yourself to drift into the spaces between words, between heartbeats, between the moments when ordinary soldiers become something more, and feel the weight of a culture born in war, nurtured by sacrifice and threatened by the very forces they had sworn to serve.